But he had a sneaking feeling that the devils he had been looking for were in that very same forest, and that was the second reason why he could not obtain his revenge. Anyone who entered the forest would find themselves having to fend off elongated branches with sharp tips that moved around like snakes, and it would only get worse the closer you got to the core of the forest where the demonic blood tree was. The first and last time he saw the demonic blood tree was many years ago, and it hadn't been as strong, allowing him to get close enough to see it. But going by the increasingly baleful aura of the forest, it was sure to have progressively grown since then, and he didn't even dare to enter the middle section of the forest, talk less of where the demonic blood tree was. So after futilely sending some men into the forest to search, he made the decision to forget about them for the time being and focus on the much more dangerous threat. The Phoenix of Envy. The name Phoenix of Envy was the title that the denizens of the South Continent had decided to call the terrifying green phoenix with unprecedented powers that had enabled it to enthrall people as it wished. Unfortunately, despite the united efforts of the continent, all it took was 10 years for the Phoenix of Envy to conquer the entirety of the monster territory, year 161 by that time. Azura, Babunda and a few of the other demon kings had fled the continent, and the rest of them had been thoroughly grasped by the Phoenix of Envy. To think that Emperor Azura, who he had been rivals with his entire life, had been forced to flee like a pitiful beast was still extremely shocking, but whenever he thought about the events that led to it he couldn't help but shiver with helpless fright. The Phoenix of Envy was really too terrifying. It was one thing for it to possess immense might that not only surpassed his and Azura's but also grew faster than theirs, but when unknown creatures from beyond the seas and even from the seas began to arrive on the continent with green-colored scales, furs, eyes or hairs, the resistance of the South Continent became utterly useless. Somehow, the Phoenix of Envy possessed the ability to both ensnare and augment beings of any race and used them as loyal soldiers. There seemed to be different levels to it, seeing as only a few were able to mutate and gain green appearances along with strange abilities, whereas the rest only gained a green aura and symbol on their forehead, but Ghost didn't know enough to speculate. What he did know was that the powers that those people gained possessed a strong enticement to both monsters and blood fiends, causing some of them, mostly monsters, to betray their rulers and join the Phoenix of Envy. Faced against a force like that, there was nothing that he or Azura could do. They were defeated. Almost killed in fact. So just like that, the Phoenix of Envy, a being who they had eventually come to learn used to be a lowly beast and not even the half and half thing that it was now, had become the new demon emperor and lord of all monsters. What a terrifying day that was. Ever since then, Ghost had come to know the true meaning of perpetual fear. Not a single day passed where he could grasp peace of mind or adequate sleep. He would always wonder when his turn would arrive and if he should flee the continent like Azura had done before the Phoenix arrived and his losses became too great. Sooner or later the terror would attack and he would have to submit or flee, and since he refused to submit, would it not be best to follow in Azura's steps and flee before he suffered an irreconcilable loss? But in the end, the thought of having to flee in such a disgraceful manner was harrowing, and he decided to wait for a little longer. His hope was that he would get lucky enough to stumble across something unique that would grant him immense power, kind of like the strange third eye that Azura had obtained a few years after the world evolved, but better so that it would enable him to fight off the Phoenix of Envy. But that didn't happen. Nothing that Ghost expected or hoped for happened. The Phoenix of Envy didn't come for him and he didn't obtain any useful power. Instead, the Phoenix of Envy seemed to be rebuilding the monster territory for its own purposes and ignored him like they hadn't been viciously fighting each other for 8 years. Like that, years continued to pass, and other than a few strange things here and there, he was actually able to regain a semblance of peace. He was even able to build up his forces without resistance and rarely ever saw the daunting figures of the powerful creatures that had invaded his continent. Of course, even if there was no fighting or warring, his territory kept on becoming smaller and smaller. Somebody from the Phoenix's new territory would cross the borders a little bit and build whatever without his permission. One day, he would learn all the strengths and weaknesses of the Phoenix of Envy and then use it against him, just like he did to Azura. Soon it would be hard, but soon, he would take it all back. Everything that belonged to him, including the entire continent, would eventually fall into his hands. It was on that day, as he was thinking such bold things, just 2 years ago, year 170, that the devils attacked. It came out of nowhere. One day, he was peacefully relaxing in his home, dreaming about his ambitions coming to fruition and picturing the face of a dead green phoenix, but then all of a sudden, a few of his subordinates audaciously ran into his room with distraught appearances and panicked faces. He had immediately known that something was wrong. Talk less of their agitated demeanors. Unless they were tired of living, they wouldn't have dared to barge into his abode without adequate reason. It was shortly after that he heard that not only were they being attacked by the devils who had disappeared 21 years ago, year 151, but they were also attacked by the Fae. The Fae, the mysterious race that had appeared on the continent a few years ago. You see, despite the fact that the war with the Phoenix of Envy had long ended, from time to time there would still be interesting figures colored in green that would arrive in the continent and unhesitatingly fly, run, swim or whatever form of movement towards the Phoenix's territory, a territory that he and other blood fiends called the Domain of Envy. But sometimes, those people would bring along their own subordinates and brethren, and the Fae were one of such groups. They were a race that looked like a more visually attractive version of humans who also had long sharper ears and large butterfly wings on their backs of different colors. They had been led by a man who had long green hair, imposing green eyes and luminous green wings. Green, green, green. The first time he saw him, despite the fact that the strange Fae had a more inferior cultivation to most of the other invaders, something around the late stages of the Third Realm, Ghost had been more wary of him than he was of a lot of the other invaders. This was because he knew that rather than judging their cultivations in conjunction with their ages like he did with other people, the best way to examine their talent and most especially their closeness with the Phoenix of Envy, was their colors. The more green they appeared, the more mutations they had obviously endured, signifying how close they were to Envy. Which of course, was not something that Ghost liked to see. He had long ago made the decision to acquiesce to any of such figures if they came with demands and avoided getting in their way. But it was most preferable that he avoided getting in their way. Unfortunately however, it appeared that apparently, if what his subordinates were telling him were to be true, one of those grand figures had finally come to his doorstep with obvious hostile intentions. But that was actually not the case. When he left his home to rush to where the fighting was occurring, instead of seeing the diversely colored wings of the Fae that he had been expecting, they were all colored red. Every last Fae had uncharacteristically pale skin, crimson red wings and ruby red eyes, possessing bloodthirsty auras that not only gave off the unmistakable vibe of the blood essence affinity that every blood fiend and devil had, but also the demonic energy that was native to the continent. How could this be? On top of that, the green-winged Fae, their ruler and perhaps progenitor, was nowhere to be seen. What was the meaning of this? Where had the Fae obtained this power? Seeing the entire Fae race radiate power that was multiple times greater than the power that they had walked into the continent with was extremely aggravating. Ghost had looked high and low for anything that would grant him a qualitative boost in power to no avail, but these half-butterfly half-human mongrels that had come into the continent only a few years ago had found something that had turned them into such cruel and bloody things. Infuriating. But that wasn't even the last of it. The devils that seamlessly fought alongside them had also experienced unnatural transformations. It was different from devil to devil, but on a random part of their bodies there were intricate, beguiling red markings that glowed with potent demonic energy. Some of them had the markings on their arms, some had the markings or their legs, some had the marking on their chests, and there were even a few whose markings had twisted to form peculiar symbols that lay on small areas of their body like their forehead, cleavage, or shoulder. These markings apparently possessed remarkable power because the devils were not only tearing apart blood fiends of similar cultivation levels like it was nothing, but they were also fighting head-to-head with blood fiends of higher levels without suffering a loss. Unimaginable. These were the same devils that had to scurry off to who knows where like rats? How could this be? He had been filled with so much rage at that moment that he personally went out to massacre swathes of devils by himself using his sharp claws. Sometimes, he would even devour their heads whilst they were alive, and it was only then that he was able to calm down. Loss after loss after loss. That was what he had been facing for many years without reprieve. But in that moment he had obtained a moment of clarity. The attack of the devils was not a curse but instead a blessing. Not only could he finally obtain the revenge that he had almost been praying to a higher power for, but he could also experiment with their bodies like he had done with many monsters in the past to perhaps harness their secrets. Marvelous! He would do it to the Fae too because clearly they had somehow deserted the banner of envy, and then he would use their powers to finally come up with a method to deal with the Phoenix. As for the attack of the combined devils and Fae? Meaningless. They had impressive power indeed, but neither of them had prospered for long enough yet and their cultivations weren't high enough. The strongest of them, other than the pesky paragon devil of theirs that was surrounded in red lightning, was in the first stage of the Third Realm. Whereas on his side, there were more than 10 fiend lords. On top of that, even their numbers were lower. Looking at such lopsided odds, one couldn't help but think that the actions of the devils and the fae was nothing other than courting death. For those wondering, Zaliucard had been exiled in year 155. From now on, I will be referring to standard cultivation as essence cultivation instead of just cultivation, unless of course I'm talking about someone's overall cultivation. This is because I want to highlight the fact that essence cultivation and anatomy cultivation are different but equal cultivation paths. Neither of the two could be considered more effective, even if essence cultivation is the mainstream in most worlds. Looking at such lopsided odds, one couldn't help but think that the actions of the devils and the fae was nothing other than courting death. Nevertheless, Ghost naturally didn't question their suicidal actions and had charged at the Paragon Devil with his arms spread out in attempt to end things once and for all. Only to be viciously intercepted by his parents via two different colored lightning bolts that miraculously sent him flying. It came as a great shock. He had always been expecting the two traitors to interfere, that's fine. But what he had not expected was the potency behind the strike. It was a power of the likes that he had never felt before. It wasn't the evil and bloody feature that the rest of the devils and fae now had, but something else altogether. It was like a fusion of the two different natured lightning bolts. Yeah, that's right. It was like the purification of Cynthia's white lightning and the corruption of Balak's purple lightning had somehow fused together to form something that rather than just try to tear his insides apart, tried to directly rearrange his composition. The purple lightning's effect would damage, corrupt and twist apart his organs, but before his natural regeneration could kick in, the white lightning would not only harm him, but it would do something that seemed to make the damage a bit more permanent. Thankfully he was strong enough to nullify most of its effects, but he had no doubt that if his natural defenses weren't so high, courtesy of his near-death experiences at the hands of the Azura and Phoenix of Envy, he wouldn't have been able to nullify the changes that the contrasting lightning bolts attempted to perform on his body. Be that as it may, it had still achieved its main purpose, which was to stall him. The few moments that his confused fright had caused him to inspect the damage that he had suffered and weigh the costs of continuation, was enough for everything to change. Boom! Out of nowhere, what seemed like a mini-tree with red-colored leaves had burst out of the ground and speared straight through his stomach and out his back with appalling ease. Then, it somehow paralyzed his body, making him look like a sacrifice as he was helpless suspended in the air. But although the wound was grievous, he had suffered worse and it wasn't enough to kill him. It was what happened next that really terrified him. Goo goo goo. It began to ferociously suck out his blood essence. His blood essence. Blood essence was extremely important to every living being, and to have it siphoned away was not only damaging to his cultivation, but also damaging to his very life force. He was in deep trouble. Trying his best to save himself, he wasn't aware that the tide of devils and fae were receding. The blood fiends of course tried to change them, unwilling to let their enemies flee after causing so much harm, but when a shout had alerted them to the situation of their progenitor, they were fraught with fear and indecision. If he had the strength to, he would have roared at them to help him immediately. There he was dying and the worthless fools were actually thinking of chasing? Luckily, they eventually came to the decision to separate. The fiend lords and other notable members of the blood fiend race rushed to help him, and the rest continued to chase the devils and fae. The people that had stayed to help him let out numerous attacks on the blood-sucking mini-tree, but they barely did any damage. Only after a long while did their combined might leave extensive damage on the mini-tree, which caused it to retreat to where it had come from. Yes. Even after so long, the combined might of all the fiend lords had still not been able to destroy the mini-tree, only managing to cause it to flee. By then, Ghost had lost a whole 17% of his blood essence, which caused his cultivation to essence cultivation to fall from the 6th stage of soul refinement, 4th realm for the enlightened races, to the 4th stage. A complete and utter loss of two stages that had taken him years to achieve, had been taken away in less than an hour. Infuriating. Bone-achingly and soul-collapsingly infuriating. He wanted to bite every last devil and fae to death with his teeth, separate the flesh from their bones with his claws, and drink every last drop of their blood until he could make back all of his losses. If he didn't do so, then he wasn't the crying Ghost. That day, Ghost had never before been so angry. But it wasn't the end. The devils and fae that had managed to flee actually came back a couple months later to sneak attack them again. But even despite the fact that he was alert of any kind of sudden change in the situation occurring once more, in fear of history repeating itself, his efforts were in vain. Balak and Cyndia had once again hit him with their abnormal fused lightning bolts, and a blood-sucking mini-tree, which he had long suspected was actually a branch of the demonic blood tree that the devils and fae had somehow summoned here, had managed to pierce through his body again. This time however, the fiend lords didn't dare shilly-sholly and quickly came to help him, bringing with themselves more help than last time. Still, it still took time to free him and he lost even more blood essence, and even more of his essence cultivation, which had dropped one more stage. That day he really did go mad. Faced with the innumerable losses that he had been enduring for the last few years and the sight of the devils and fae running away once again, something within him snapped. This time, he was absolutely unwilling to let the devils and fae run away without paying the price again. So he chased them. He disregarded the giant hole in his stomach and chased them without any other thought than slaughter and destruction, his all-red eyes blazing with a furious and erratic light in a way that it had never done before. Considering the direction they had run to, he was able to confirm for a second time that all of his problems had spawned from the very forest that he had been born in, but he didn't care. All he wanted to do was kill. He quickly caught up to them and it was like an ogre jumping into a crowd of goblins. Absolutely no contest. He slashed bodies in half, ripped out arms and legs, tore off heads like he was plucking off flower heads and latched onto necks with his teeth to drain out the blood of his victims in seconds, but his most favorite attack by far was to impale his victims in the same location that he had been impaled in as he watched their quivering faces filled with fear fall slack as they entered the embrace of death. He had killed roughly 40% of them, which left the amount of fae remaining with very few numbers since they were much less fae than devils, when 3 different colored lightning bolts struck his body at once, causing him extensive damage. Purple and white were obviously expected, but the new red one was something that he had not experienced before. But he knew who it belonged to. Even if he wasn't already well acquainted with the owner, he still would have been able to guess who it was immediately. Who else could it be other than the son of Cyndia and Balak, Sinbad? The red lightning coursed through his body chaotically, borrowing the energy of the other 2 lightning bolts to actually cause damage to his body and exhibit the effects of its own innate nature, which, to his utter dismay, was to siphon his blood. It even showed signs of interacting with his blood essence. Ghost had no doubt that if Sinbad was stronger than him, then he really would have been able to siphon his blood essence just like that damn tree. He had to kill him. He tried to rush towards the boy to eliminate the threat, but another combined lightning attack that was even stronger than before slammed into him and sent him flying. Sent him flying? When was the last time that he had ever been sent flying if he wasn't fighting Azura, Babunda, or the Phoenix of Envy? Never. But it was as he was growling with pain and frustration that he finally recognized the rapidly declining state of his body. His flesh had sunken, his skin was paler than normal, there were burns all over his body including his organs, and there was a giant hole in his stomach that wasn't healing. He was in significant danger. In fact, he reckoned that if he took 2 or 3 more of those strikes, he would be placed in a position of no return. So, with one last glare that promised endless suffering, he fled without hesitation. He wasn't a fool, and with his head clearer than it was when he had started the massacre, he could finally resume making the correct decisions. There was no point in trying to eradicate a threat to his life if doing so without preparation in on itself was a threat to his life. The only option left was to flee. Of course, whilst slashing any devil or fae that got too close. Lightning bolts tried to strike, but he was able to dodge them without much problem since his mind was 100% set on fleeing. In the end, he was able to escape without suffering any more damage. However, his glee at killing so many of his enemies that he had been hunting for so long quickly turned sour when he investigated the extent of the damage. Just like he had feared, although he had healed completely wrongly. The open flesh from the hole in his stomach had been covered by powerful muscles and perfect skin like normal, but the hole was still there. It was similar to the stump that an inferior being would gain if they were to survive getting their hands cut off. Most blood fiends, if provided with adequate blood, would be able to regenerate the loss of biomass after they entered the final stage of the body refinement realm, Realm 1. He, on the other hand, didn't even need blood to regenerate anymore. It was just automatic. And in the times where he obtained extreme wounds created by special attacks that left its essence in his body, all he needed to do, if using his own energy to purge the blight didn't work, was drink some potent blood. Using another powerful blood fiend for that always worked. But not this time. He had practically drained almost all of his fiend lords and even gained a small amount of power from it, but his wounds and missing biomass did not regenerate. They healed, but they did not regenerate. This meant that the disordered state of his body that was heavily dampening his energy output was permanent. All the twisted blood vessels and magic circuits, the misshapen organs and shrunken flesh, all if it would stay the way it was. It could be imagined how infuriated he had been. Only much, much later, when many moons had passed and madness was once more beginning to encroach upon his mind, that he did something completely drastic. Driven by the insane desire to rid himself from the unsightly imperfection that his body had been reduced to, he used his own claws to gouge out every last wound on his body, then, without hesitance, once more indulged in the blood of his fiend lords. His deranged hope was that if he could rid himself of the imperfect flesh, his perfect true and perfect flesh would regenerate after drinking some blood. If it worked, good. If it didn't and he regrew the imperfect flesh, then he would find some place to fight to the death. Luckily, it worked. It took a lot more blood than the wounds that he had suffered should have, but by the end of the process, he was once more perfect. For someone who didn't have the ability to endlessly regenerate like a blood fiend, they would have been forced to accept the fate that Ghost had been subjected to, permanently. How terrifying. But he wasn't like them. He was Ghost, the perfect being, the progenitor of all blood fiends, and from that day forward, the nightmare of the forest of bloody origin. Yes. The exact moment that he finally healed all the damages in his body, he ignored the fiend lords that had made sacrifices for him and went out to hunt. The rage that had been festering in his soul wanted nothing else. However, on his journey towards the forest, his sanity had been returning to him bit by bit, and as such, all the things that could go wrong in invading the forest of bloody origin flickered through his thoughts and slowly sapped away the speed in his legs. His sprint became a canter, his canter became a bound, and his bound became a stroll. Eventually, he had completely stopped moving and just stared off in the direction of the forest. He stood there like a frozen statue for many, many hours. And then he left. He had given up on invading the forest on his lonesome, but he had not given up on killing its inhabitants. From that day forth, he was truly a nightmare to the devils and fae. Having gathered an uncountable amount of blood fiends to surround the entire forest, anybody who tried to escape it had died a gruesome death. Sometimes they would turtle up and refuse to come out, but when they did so, he would heartlessly use his ability as a progenitor to command hordes of blood fiends to run towards wherever they were hiding and then blow themselves up along with their surroundings. He wasn't able to see it, but he was sure that over 90% of the thousands of blood fiends that he sent each time would die before they completed their purpose. By this point in time he accumulated a small understanding of how the forest of bloody origin worked and knew that so long as he could send in many weaklings at a time, although a majority would become nourishment for the strange crimson leaf trees, a few would be able to penetrate through them and enter the living area of the devils and fae. The only reason why he or other fiend lords and powerful realm 3 blood fiends couldn't enter was because they would be immediately focused on. The bloodthirsty trees would directly ignore the weaklings and stretch their hair-raising branches towards the best source of energy. The last time he had gone in, the demonic blood tree itself had directly acted. So he could only come up with this method. Sending in thousands of similarly low-leveled blood fiends along with a few mid-leveled ones in hopes that whilst the mid-leveled ones caught the attention of the trees and died, the low-leveled ones would have enough time to reach the devils and fae and finally complete their mission. And it worked. The amount of blood fiends that actually managed to succeed, he was sure, were very low, but they were still able to do it. They were able to enter the dwellings of the devils and fae where they proceeded to blow up their own magic cores as commanded. How did he know they succeeded if they were obviously unable to report back to him? Why, that was because of the rage-filled faces of devils and fae as they charged out of their forest with the unmistakable emotion of vengeful fury written all over their skin. Ah, those faces! How they filled him with such glee. But all good things must come to an end. After the devils and fae realized that turtling up would only cause more people to die and stopped hiding, Ghost had begun to indulge in a new activity. Driven by the volatile emotions within him that yearned to mark its existence on reality, he had discovered art. He would carefully dissect the bodies of devils and fae alike so that he could obtain their noses, ears, lips, skin, bones, muscles, wings and more, and then create something new from the body parts. Sometimes it would be another grotesque-looking humanoid with multiple limbs, eyes and wings, but other times it could be strange objects and constructions that had multiple mouths and ears all over it. It was something so completely unprecedented and filled with madness that even the blood fiends would look at him terror. However, he didn't care. The activity had become his favorite pastime, and anybody who thought of him wrongly for that could become a part of his materials. Unfortunately, it was this favorite pastime of his that would end up becoming the final nail in the coffin. On a day that he had least expected it, someone other than a member of his race had come to visit the forest by himself. It was Zalucard, the leader, or rather ex-leader of the Fae, but unlike his fellow Fae, he was still flooded with green colors and in fact seemed to have even more green aesthetic markings laced his arms, and he had gained another set of wings. Now, they truly looked like butterfly wings. They were noble and ethereal and possessed a beguiling charm. On top of that, he himself had become immeasurably more attractive. His every movement was filled with grace and a deadly charm that easily caught all attention. Clearly, he had undergone some sort of evolution. But as he appeared above the sea of blood fiends with obvious intentions of visiting the forest or at least its periphery, he just so happened to catch sight of Ghost's newest creation. A beast-like thing with many eyes on its face that had huge red wings on its back. The catch was that those gigantic wings seemed to have been formed from tens of Fae wings. And he noticed. The whole reason that Ghost had the confidence to slaughter the Fae as he wished was because he knew that they had somehow aligned themselves with the demonic blood tree instead of the Phoenix of Envy. Their leader, who he had always known was still aligned with the Phoenix, should have abandoned them. He knew about the ridiculous loyalty that each creature in green had for the Phoenix, so guessing such a thing wasn't strange at all. In fact, if the Phoenix of Envy ordered the Fae leader to slaughter all Fae, Ghost knew that he would do it. And he would do it without hesitation. But the look of absolute malice that crept on the Fae leader's face as he stared at him made him think of two things. 1. Perhaps he was wrong. 2. He needed to leave the continent. Immediately. Although the Fae leader was still much weaker than him, he knew that it was time to go. There were two ways about it. The ferocious look of pure malice that promised him endless suffering wasn't something that he hadn't seen before, but in his experience, each and every time he had seen a face like that being directed towards him, trouble always followed. It wasn't always instant and it was obviously never endless, but each and every time somebody dared to look at him like that, if they didn't die, they would deliver. The delivery might be weak, but more than enough times it was not. After all, only those who had the utmost assurance in themselves would look at him, the blood fiend progenitor, like that. Even the weaklings that he had terrorized in the past were too occupied with feeling either fear, desperation, or despair, unable to summon the slightest wisp of rage with the threat of death looming over their heads. Later, if they were still alive and he was already far, far away, they might snort their noses and stamp their feet to display their fruitless feeling of indignation, but nothing much more. What else could they do? It was only people who knew that they could do something, people who were confident in their own viciousness or the viciousness of their backing, that would dare to look at him like that. And as such, he always made sure to kill anybody that looked at him like that even if the costs were obscene, but obviously, this time, he could not. He would have the Phoenix of Envy to deal with if he dared. In rare situations like that, he would have to hope that he could withstand the delivery or hope that somebody else killed the deliverer, but obviously, this time, that would not be the case. Nobody on this continent dared to kill the creatures in green. Nobody but the Phoenix of Envy himself, and obviously, that would not happen. The Fae leader was intent on seeing his destruction and had more than enough ways to ensure it without lifting a finger. That was how powerful a few of the creatures in green had grown. Of course, he was still immensely powerful himself, but if all the creatures in green gathered to kill him, that would be his end. The Phoenix of Envy wouldn't even need to show up. He understood all of that and more the moment the Fae leader gave him that face. So, without hesitating, he turned towards the mass of blood fiends and ignored the Fae. Before the Fae leader could say anything more than you, he had already sent an order to his entire race, causing them to follow him with mixed emotions, with the predominant one being fear, as he rushed to the edge of the continent. He was fleeing immediately. Unfortunately, 3/4 of the way there, a mighty force of monsters, with a few of them bearing green symbols on their heads, had intercepted and attacked them without even asking them to surrender. This army only continued to grow the longer the ferocious war went on, and not before long even creatures in green and demon kings had begun to show up, laying waste to the blood fiend race. By the time he had reached the shore and wiped out the surrounding forces of envy with the help of his fiend lords and other strong blood fiends, only a paltry 12,000 plus of the previous nearly 200,000 plus blood fiends were remaining. That event was by far the biggest loss that the blood fiend race had suffered to date, and even a few of his more careless fiend lords had perished in the battle. This was mostly due to the fact that unlike any other war in the past, the Blood Fiends couldn't hide, retreat or even use the environment to their advantage. It had been very clear where they were going and their enemies knew it. They had been forced to run through an open grassland, a small and sparse forest, and a desert, facing innumerable attacks all the way. But they did it. They had managed to escape from the forces of envy, and with the help of Fiend Lord Jean and a few other blood fiends with the rare ice affinity, they had slowly ventured into the sea. A little more than a year had passed since then, and the icy road that they had been building all this time had grown extremely long. Ghost had seen all kinds of terrific sea beasts and sea monsters, and they were all quite interesting. Sometimes, when he was in the mood, he would kill them for fun and collect their body parts to facilitate his new hobby. It was unfortunate that he had been forced to abandon all the devil and fey materials, but he tried not to dwell on that. If he thought about what he had been enduring in the South Continent the last few decades, his blood would boil. So instead, he liked to think about his future. Even with his lack of experience outside of the South Continent, he could tell that the Phoenix of Envy was something completely unnatural. Not only had it been the first creature to enter his continent, proving that it was already a being like no other, but it had also kicked out two powerful emperors who had long established deep foundations that should have kept them safe. What were the chances of running into something like that once again? It had to be impossible, it just had to be. Because otherwise... Ghost felt a shiver run up his spine as the images of past events passed through his mind. However, it was at this moment that he caught a change in the scenery. A change in the endless blues. That's land, right? Ghost murmured to himself. It's quite big, even from here. Can I have finally found another continent? He had seen many islands on his journey and had even stopped at a few to boost up his reserves. After all, he couldn't always drink the blood of his fellow blood fiends. It got quite boring. However, what he wanted to find was another continent. Even after suffering defeat after defeat, his ambitions still knew no bounds. He had always desired to be Kaiser, and that had not changed. That would not change. But he would not be Kaiser of a pitiful island. No, that would never be enough. He had the potential to rule a large continent, and he would not allow himself any less. It may be harder with the massive decrease in the number of blood fiends, but everyone who was left was strong, smart, and most importantly resilient. But was that even a continent in the first place? As he mulled over the question with mild hope, he suddenly remembered that he had someone, or rather something, he could ask who would give him a definitive answer. System. Is that a continent? Ever since things had fallen apart and all that he knew had turned on its head, he had been relying on the system more and more for answers that he himself could not answer. Ding! Yes. That is a continent. Ding! Congratulations, host, you have discovered another of the 5 grand continents, the East Continent. Finally! Ghost inwardly roared with bubbling glee. But as plans for conquest began to rumble through his mind, he couldn't help but think of a familiar face that he had not seen in a long time. I wonder where Azura ended up. Could he be on this continent? I hope not. I'm truly tired of seeing his ugly face. Anyways, he left from another direction, so it should be fine. Ghost thought with narrowed eyes. Strangely, the thought of Azura dying never crossed his mind. Eridel's all-seeing gaze rolled over the multiple eye-catching events occurring all over the world. The Blood Fiends were about to invade the East Continent, where they would eventually stumble upon either the Burning Nines or the Eloria Empire, the empire established by Empress Gloria, the High Human Queen now Empress, who had 9 mixed kings/queens under her direct command. Gaia had become a full-fledged goddess of creation and had erected her own religion called the Divine Syndicate of Genesis. Its domain of influence had been expanding without any competition, and now, its reach had extended out of the Western Forest and had even seeped into other central locations of power. Now, everybody on the continent knew about Gaia, the so-called eldest god of heaven and almighty dragon goddess of creation, causing the knowledge of gods to be fully exposed to the central continent. Most people didn't believe it too much, considering the fact that there wasn't much evidence, but when they remembered the golden beam of light that had emerged from the Dragon Mountain but had been seen all over the continent, they couldn't help but feel extremely wary. Yorma was, as always, becoming increasingly powerful. She had become so large that it had become public knowledge that she was the 3rd celestial beast, and her control over her powers, most specifically her evil eye of petrification, had become abnormally uncanny. Clearly, she was more than just brawn. Her siblings, Draco, Lily and Hikulu, were also more powerful. They were all at the 4th realm and had unlocked even more of their innate powers. Draco's fire was extremely feared by many and was something that even some of the most powerful figures on the continent tried to avoid. Lily's power of illusions and enthrallment had grown, and Hikulu, who now had 4 heads, was a fearsome figure whose powerful poison struck fear even in the hearts of the continent's 2 celestial beasts. Reiko the Golden Tiger had become a beast emperor with 5 kings/queens under his banner. A tiger queen, someone who he had been raising to be his wife, only for her to fall in love with someone else, a cunning but loyal wolf king, a mighty and fierce bear king, a charming and intelligent monkey queen, and finally, a battle-hungry yet wise eagle queen who loved the hunt. All of them were in the 4th realm thanks to Reiko's vast resources, and they were quietly thriving in their respective territories. At first, Eridel had felt a little sorry for Reiko's failed attempt at love, even if he had seen it coming, but when he took a peek into his soulmate link out of curiosity and found out who it was attached to, he couldn't help but call the Golden Tiger a lucky bastard. But perhaps the woman was the lucky bastard? After all, Reiko was only one of her 2 soulmates. Moving along, it appeared that interesting things were taking place in the sea. Powerful figures were emerging like it was nothing, and the average power of the sea dwellers were only continuing to rise. Alas, this was at the cost of lives upon lives upon lives. At this point, it wasn't rare to suddenly see a large section of the sea become red with blood as a result of a terrible carnage. However, it wasn't like they were all senselessly killing. Having gained more and more intelligence along with their increasing accomplishments in cultivation, they had learned how to maximize their gains. Powerful sea beasts and monsters had learned how to take control of those weaker than them and have them diligently work for them. These creatures became the kings and emperors of the sea. The only reason it took them so much longer than the creatures above the sea was because of the fact that they were so used to killing and killing and killing that it had become instinctive. There was no pity and there was no mercy. In fact, there wasn't even anything interesting to do in the sea other than killing. For them to gain control of their instincts and use their indomitable auras to force others into doing the same, was much more impressive than the beast and monster lords above the seas. And going by the current course of events, it looked like multiple emperors were about to enter an all-out war which would give birth to the first Kaiser of the sea, something much more powerful than a continental Kaiser. Over in the South Continent, the demon god of envy, Honorable Brother, was planning something so heinous that Eridel couldn't help but frown with his non-existent face. But thinking about the crazy thing that he had implemented into his world before he knew of its quite possibly life-ending costs, he felt like those very costs weren't so ugly anymore. Because with that, he knew that even if the Honorable Brother's plans actually began to come into fruition, he would be able to put it all to an end without having to directly kill him. Still, he would rather that the world, yes world, deal with it themselves. Other than that, because of the demon god's hyper-focus on his plans and lack of care for what the rest of the continent were doing, the devils and fae of the Forest of Bloody Origin had begun to not only recuperate peacefully, but also claim the entire territory of the now fleeing blood fiends. This was another thing that made him frown. After all, the devils were really and truly quite evil. If it wasn't because of the Paragon Devil, who, thanks to the 7th aspect of his inherited divine demon physique, free from fate, was free from his innately evil desires, and the 5th aspect of the divine demon physique, divine ruler, which made any and all people who considered him their leader adopt his own way of thinking and morals. Eridel really might have had to give the same treatment that he was reserving for the Honorable Brother and other future demon gods. As for the barbarians who used to live in the Forest of Dawn along with other illustrious races like the elves and divine dragons, well, they weren't doing good at all. As a matter of fact, their situation was quite a sorry one. Although they had beast-like constitutions that allowed them to absorb energy from the meat that they eat and a ferocity that wasn't inferior to any predator, the competition that they had was just too great. Elves who had a tree of life, spring of life and a supreme aid like Sierra, divine dragons whose bodies naturally grew up to be very large and extremely powerful, Beast Emperor Reiko and his Beast Empire, and finally, Dodo the Guardian of the Forest and his Glacial Saint Deer clan. None of these factions were something that the fledgling barbarian clan could compete with, and as a result, not only was the barbarian chief not in the 4th realm like the other mutated human race progenitors, Crying Ghost and the High Human Empress, but they had also had to flee their home in search for a safer territory. This was definitely going to become a blight in their history if their progeny lived to tell the tale, but who knows, maybe this could end up becoming the greatest decision that they ever made. Moving on, Eridel was actually very fascinated with something that was going on within the Celestial Desert, the desert in the south of the central continent that celestial beast Apis had claimed as his territory. Although it wasn't exactly a peaceful territory considering the fact that it was still a desert and lacked an adequate amount of naturally growing food, it was still the most peaceful territory of its kind. This was because Apis, their regional lord, had long ago kicked out or outright exterminated the more violent races in his territory. Having suffered from the torment of the more crueler races like the sunlit hyenas and the four-legged death vultures before becoming a celestial beast, he had been exceptionally vicious to them when he had finally gained power. In fact, as soon as he had woken up from his celestial transformation and realized how powerful he had become, his executions began immediately. But that was not what Eridel found interesting. Instead, he was far more interested in the 3 to 4 meter tall humans that had large ears and prominent tusks sticking out of their mouths. Quite some time ago, the last remaining humans of the desert had stumbled upon the apocalyptic 500-meter tall figure of Apis the celestial elephant and had nearly died from the gaze that was cast towards them. They fully expected to be killed without resistance and immediately prostrated themselves in hopes that the nightmarish being wouldn't care about them. However, unexpectedly, it was at that moment that a large flock of four-legged vultures chose to attack them. They lamented their fate and despaired, but unlike what they were expecting, they heard a furious elephant roar that was so loud that it shook the lands and damaged their ears. Without pause, Apis crushed the entire flock of vultures with a single blow from his trunk, inadvertently saving the lives of the last remaining humans in the south of the central continent. Without being long-winded, after being saved by the majestic celestial beast in such shocking fashion, they decided to fully pledge their allegiance, or servitude to be specific. More than a decade later, the celestial beast, who was pleased with their adaptability, intelligence and loyalty, decided to do something that no other beast had ever done. The humans, who had become quite prosperous in this time, had simultaneously become fanatical about Apis, the beast who was quite literally their lord and savior. They treated him like a god, and this only increased every time they saw him accomplish world-breaking feats that no other being could. It wasn't long before they began to think and do the strange things that situations like this caused to those that were more ignorant, but one of those things was asking for the celestial blood of their lord, and as one can guess, Apis had obviously agreed. Despite the absurd request, he did it. He gave out his blood freely, not knowing the effects it would cause. As a result, those humans became what they were now, the first beastkin in the Iridius world. To be exact, celestial elephant beastkin. But make no mistake, celestial beast blood wasn't something so easily ingested. In fact, other than the chief of the tribe who was the strongest, everyone who was granted the blood imploded, and even with the chief it was a very close call, and that was after seeing what happened to others and only taking a few sips instead of chugging it down. Blood from powerful beasts, especially celestial beasts, was extremely valuable, but it was even dangerous if you weren't careful. But speaking about humans becoming powerful, the situation in the North Continent was going really well. Although Sarakiel's unique path of power was unable to be passed on just yet because of a lack of specialist equipment, Gabriel had been able to pass on his various martial arts along with their shared essence cultivation technique that allowed them to more efficiently absorb the ambient magical energy into their magic cores and convert it into their own mana, more than 10x faster than the basic cultivation technique that every enlightened being was born with. Thanks to this, they had been able to claim large amounts of territory from the undead-infested continent and now had the entire southern sector under their control. They were still hidden, of course, hidden away in their secret bases to prevent the original undead from ending everything they fought for in a single moment, but everybody on the continent who had a well-functioning brain knew that the southern sector was owned by the humans, and if you wanted to enter, tread carefully. However, in contrast to the increasing circumstances of the North Continent's southern sector, the situation of the rest of the continent was rapidly declining. It was becoming increasingly brutal, and the few remaining beasts who were actually of the living had either been mercilessly killed or converted into the undead. But that did not mean the slaughter had ended or even slowed. No, it was just as chaotic as ever, and this was because of the existence of the mutant undead. So far, there were 3 known classifications of undead in the Iridius world: original undead, lesser undead and mutant undead. The original undead were the beings that had been killed and then forcefully assimilated with one of the slime abomination's children that were created with the skill called reproduction, and although there were only less than 30 of them left, they alone possessed an ironclad grip on the rest of the undead world and were completely insurmountable. This was because as pseudo-descendants of the slime abomination, they possessed the same, but to a much minor extent, ability to absorb some of the strength, durability, agility and intelligence of whatever they ate. There used to be a lot more original undead on the continent, but after they all gathered in the Forest of Death, they all slaughtered and devoured each other until there were only 37 of them left. The lesser undead were beings who had recently died, but had somehow received a vast infusion of undead essence. It was possible for ancient corpses to be converted this way, but the amount of undead essence needed made it an extremely rare occurrence for it to happen naturally, and quite expensive for someone who wanted to personally create the undead themselves. These lesser undead aren't too different from abominations in the fact that they are always in a state of discomfort if they don't siphon any life force, and for this reason, they are always seeking to devour more and more. Unfortunately, as soon as any life force enters their bodies, the comfort and pleasure it gives them only lasts for a few seconds, kind of like a drug, before it is immediately converted into undeath essence. This undeath essence increases the power of the undead, but to the lesser undead who lack intelligence, power barely means anything to them, all they want is to stop suffering. But speaking of intelligence, the fact that they're all dumb is not quite true. The intelligence of a lesser undead is connected to their strength, it's just that the ratio is so appalling that a lesser undead had to be in the third realm just to have the barest amount of self-awareness. Luckily, so long as they kept eating living beings and surviving, they could raise their strength and subsequently their intelligence. For the record, these so-called lesser undead are usually the only kind of undead on most other planets, and are normally just called the undead. The mutant undead were much more impressive than the lesser undead, and although it wasn't a unique existence to the Iridius world, they were very rare. Throughout the many locations in the universe they had different names. For example, the unhallowed region of the Lole galaxy called them greater undead, but there were other names like higher undead, unique undead and perfect undead, but in Iridius, they were just called the mutant undead. The methods to create these beings were surprisingly numerous, but the reason for their existence in Iridius was because of one thing and one thing only, and that was the Forest of Death, which had become a sacred land. The ambient magical energy in that forest had long since become something else entirely. It was of course still energy, but unlike pure magical energy or even a normal sacred land's ambient magical energy, it had a large mixture of affinities which was already extremely rare, but its predominant ones were undeath essence, death essence and something reminiscent of chaos, something that was definitely because of the abomination, whose very presence had created it. And because of this strangely mixed nefarious energy, any corpse, that wasn't already an undead, that stayed in the forest long enough, would automatically become a mutant undead. Mutant undeads were much more powerful than regular undead and had a much easier time gaining intelligence. The interesting thing was that as they became stronger, they actually began to regain the memories that they had when they were alive. The only thing was that 9.9 out of 10 times, they didn't care for them, they only used the useful knowledge and discarded things like emotions and relationships with their previous loved ones. But that was not the only unique thing about them. The other thing about them is that, they actually preyed on other undead. In fact, devouring other undead was far more beneficial for them than living beings. Normally, undeath essence within an undead was like the various blood types of humans, which meant absorbing one of a different type could cause serious issues. However, every undead's inner undeath essence was unique and it was impossible to find another undead with compatible undeath essence, which was why regular undead rarely ever attacked each other, talk less of each other. But this wasn't a problem for the mutant undead. The mutant undead possessed the amazing ability to absorb the undeath essence of other undead and make it completely theirs, allowing them to become stronger much faster than a lesser undead. But this is not to say that they would forsake living beings for other undead, nay, they liked both. It just so happens that other undead were much tastier, and it was because of this that the continent was still so full of slaughter. The North Continent was by far the most depressing location in the entire Iridius world. And that came with more tangible problems than it sounded like it should, but truth be told, calling those things tangible was a very big stretch. After all, what they really were called was resentful spirits, and they were exactly what they sounded like they were, the remnant souls of the dead that possessed a hatred so deep that it could evaporate the seas or freeze the deserts. A desire for revenge so abnormally heavy that even when they should have lost all intelligence and departed to the reincarnation cycle, they absolutely refused. These were generally the type of people who say things like, even if I were to be reduced to 2 eyeballs, I will stare you to death, and genuinely mean it. These were generally the type of people who say things like, even if I were to be reduced to 2 eyeballs, I will stare you to death, and genuinely mean it. And as could be expected, they were not normal at all, even before they died and became the aberrations that they were. There had always been something wrong about them, something that wasn't quite right up in their heads. But do not confuse that for something evil. The desire for revenge in on itself wasn't necessarily born out of malicious intent, oftentimes it was only a means of self-preservation that prevented one from falling into degeneracy. Some people need to know that they weren't weak, that if they were pushed enough they could turn into wrathful beasts that weren't to be trifled with, that if it came down to it they were just as fierce as anyone else and were not helpless prey. But then there were the people who decided to take revenge on a person who they perceived to be weak, standing up to them. That was more in line with the concept of evil, the sin of pride to be exact. Nevertheless, when this desire for revenge was pushed to unbelievable extremes even after death, a resentful spirit could be born. No, it was almost certain it would be born. The only time that they couldn't be conceived was if there was no ambient magical energy to facilitate it. That's why the idea of a ghost existing in a low-tier world was a joke. In truth, in most situations a resentful spirit wasn't that much of a worry. Their constitutions were innately imperfect and as a result their lifespans were extremely short. This was because although they had a new body, it was terribly malformed and impure, which caused it to constantly lose its vitality. This new body of theirs was a spirit body, something that was composed of unique energy called spirit essence, a type of soul energy that was to a soul what flesh and blood was to a biological body, hence a portion of the name resentful spirit. But not only were most resentful spirits spawned with a very sparse amount of it, because of the fact that most souls didn't need any other vessel than the physical entity they were residing in, and thus didn't have a spirit essence in the first place. But they also had other harmful essences mixed into their spirit bodies that caused them small malfunctions. One of these malfunctions was periodic memory loss. Over the duration of their short lifetime they would experience bouts of complete memory loss, and would even lose a portion of it permanently before the rest came back. Eventually, they would lose all memories and wouldn't be too different from the moping souls in the reincarnation cycle. Quite a sad fate. But that was not nearly the end of their problems. The most pressing one was that although the conversion of a flesh and blood body to a resentful spirit body was a special phenomenon that formed some of the required spirit essence, it was not nearly enough. It was too thin and lacking in quality, and don't forget the other harmful essences mixed within it that slowly damaged it over time. In conclusion, a newborn resentful spirit was like a very, very, very malnourished person who had been afflicted with diseases and poison. If nothing happened, the longest they would live was a week, but it was common for them to die within a day. However, didn't they say that the heavens always left at least one door open for everybody? Who knows, but that was certainly the case for resentful spirits. Although they could not be touched or be seen by the living or even the undead, because of their lack of substance that was barely higher than the lowest level energy, that did not mean that they could not be touched or seen by each other. When a resentful ghost met another of its kind or any other being with a spirit body, collectively called spiritual beings, they were driven by an instinctive desire to assimilate the other and make themselves more whole. Yes, resentful ghosts had an ability similar to the mutant undead to devour and assimilate other spiritual beings. And this not only gained them more spirit essence which made them quite a bit stronger, but contrary to expectations, the process actually expunged some of the harmful essences within the body, granting them more health and a longer lifespan alongside a reduction of the problems innate to a resentful spirit body. If enough resentful spirits gathered together, or a resentful spirit that was lucky enough to keep finding other weaker kin met a certain milestone, then eventually, what was known as a ghost would be born. A true ghost. And that's when things became problematic. Ghosts were an evolved form of a resentful spirit, and a few other spiritual beings, and they had perfectly pure spirit bodies that were absent of any imperfections. And in this state, they could control the density of their bodies. The degree at which they could do so was correlated to their strength, so most of them could only become transparent at best, but they could be touched. And they could touch others. And although they were finally whole and no longer needed to siphon spirit essence from others, that did not mean that they would stop. They, like any other being with self-awareness, desire more and more. More strength, more intelligence and more evolutions. And now, they could prey on the living who had complete souls that they could devour. Although it wasn't the soul itself that they wanted, when devoured, all of its energy would be converted into spirit energy, which was far more beneficial than the spirit energy of a resentful spirit. With the ability to control when they were seeable and tangible, if they were careful enough and preyed on those that were weaker than them, they would rarely ever face any kind of resistance. And in the Iridius world where specialist professions like ghost hunters or spirit warriors had yet to even be thought about, talk less of practiced, these ghosts would eventually grow to be extremely powerful. Currently, there were 5 ghosts that had achieved their second evolution and had become something known as ghost lords. 2 were in the sea, another 2 were in the North Continent, and the last was in the South Continent. That ghost had long become a creature in green under the banner of envy and had a larger edge than others of its kind, but not even he was the strongest ghost in Iridius. That title went to the one and only ghost king on the planet, Bararak from the north. Bararak was a fearsome figure, and although he wasn't as famous as other hegemony figures of the North Continent, courtesy of his unparalleled stealth abilities, he was just as powerful, and his strength was only continuing to grow. After all, there weren't many people on the continent who could defend against his unique abilities. However, although the threat of a ghost king who could devour souls as he wished was incredibly high, Eridel paid little mind to it when faced with other matters concerning the North Continent. A solution for the constantly spawning resentful spirits had already been devised, and eventually, they would all become one of his many strengths instead of the festering blight that they were. He had far bigger problems on hand, and one of them was mere seconds away from discovering something that would irreconcilably destroy his plans if he let it happen. This person was none other than the Wraith King, the Demon King, who after being chased into the slime abomination's lair by the original undead had somehow suddenly returned a few years later as an original undead himself, with power so incontestable that he became the very thing that all the originals had been fighting each other to become. The indisputable leader of the 32 originals and the sole ruler of all undead. 32 because 4 of them had died. The Wraith King had undoubtedly experienced a great turnaround, and his power had explosively grown. He had even become an original undead himself with a mutagenic undeath essence that had fused with the extremely corruptive demonic energy, making him much stronger than the other original undead even if they had the exact same cultivation levels as him. But this clearly pointed towards a connection with the slime abomination itself. As a matter of fact, the reason that the Wraith King had so quickly become the lord of all undead wasn't just because he had slaughtered 4 other originals. Although that had certainly helped, there was more to it. The true reason that the other original undead had finally given up resistance and submitted to the Wraith King after his domineering display was because of one thing. And that was the aura of the being who had made them what they were. The aura of their ancestor who should have been sealed, radiating off of the Wraith King in billowing waves that caused them to instinctively shiver with primordial fear. Clearly, the slime abomination was inhabiting the Wraith King. Perhaps not literally, but it was definitely in control of everything that the Wraith King did. And as Eridel watched, the Wraith King, or rather the slime abomination in the form of the Wraith King, lifted up its ghostly head like a snake that had detected prey and gazed towards a particular direction with a terribly eerie focus. The slime abomination had found the home of the humans. And if nothing happened, the final remaining humans on the North Continent would end up extinct like their peers in the South Continent, and Eridel's plans for them would be reduced to dust. But how could I possibly let that happen? Eridel thought to himself as he began to form his avatar in a certain location. North Continent, Southern Sector, Unknown Forest. In a quiet forest that was seemingly absent of any cognizant life forms or even other undead, the Wraith King stood, or rather floated next to a tree in his true form. The way he looked at it was as if it held all the secrets to the universe, and even his spirit sense, which could no doubt expand across many miles, was now only 50 meters large, sacrificing visibility over a large amount of space for extremely honed focus on a small area. As a result of this, he was able to realize that this unassuming tree, no, the entire space around him, was not as it seemed. It was an illusion. Thanks to the many beings that he, the slime abomination, had assimilated when he was free, he had an abundant amount of knowledge about many things, and illusions were one of them. Furthermore, thanks to a few strange beasts like the sky-bounding bunnies and the violet baleful oxes, he even had a few illusion abilities himself. And as such, when he came to this forest looking for the humans that he had been interested in for a while, he realized that everything that he was seeing was fake. It was all an illusion, and it seemed to be stemming from this very tree. The Wraith King's spirit sense shrunk from 50 meters to 5 meters, completely enveloping the entire tree with even greater intensity and threatening to reveal all of its secrets. But just as the slime abomination felt like it had discovered something, a blinding light suddenly burst into existence with ferocious and majestic might. The light emitted an aura so boundless that for the first time since the abomination became what it was now, it felt the threat of death. This was extremely terrifying. After all, with its wealth of life-saving abilities and its own aberrant constitution, death had become a concept that was as irrelevant as the blue sky. Nothing could kill it. But now, what was the situation? This clear and unadulterated feeling of looming doom. He had to flee. The slime abomination didn't even take into consideration that he wasn't even here in his own body and immediately tried to flee, the Wraith King's ethereal cloak that was previously flowing calmly now fluttering wildly in a sign of clear agitation. Now. No need for that, I just arrived. Come, let us chat. The voice was like a tangible mist that integrated into the Wraith King's body and completely stopped it from moving. However, the abomination hiding within didn't even pause before trying to forcefully cut off the connection between itself and the Wraith King in the next moment, not even caring about the possible large amount of time it would take to find another host that it could take control of. Its instincts were telling it that it had to flee and to flee immediately, and that was exactly what it would do. But the result was failure. No matter how much it tried, it could not destroy the portion of its consciousness residing within the Wraith King at all. In fact, it couldn't do anything. The Wraith King's body had been hijacked and any attempt to do anything other than speak was no longer under the abomination's control. How terrifying! For the first time in a very long time, the slime abomination felt fear completely flood its mind. No, even before it had become an abomination it had never once felt like this. Never even encountered something like this. What on Iridius was this light and where had it come from? Alas! There was nothing it could do other than to helplessly watch as the golden light, which had been endlessly growing and filling the entire forest with its presence, suddenly began to contract. It was like it had imploded, collapsing into itself so quickly that before the abomination could even make sense of what was happening, what looked like a very tall male human with long white hair and golden eyes had taken its spot and all the light had vanished. But that notion only lasted a second or two before the abomination realized that the man was the light. The terrifying aura was originating from him. How could this be? How could anybody be this strong? The abomination inwardly screamed with shock and fear. Its memories as the calamity that had single-handedly almost wiped away all life on the North Continent let it know that other than the strange talking cloud that it had once encountered, nobody else should be stronger than itself. But what was the situation? What seemed to be a human of all things, was standing before it and relegating it to a state that it didn't even dare to make a single sound. How? Good. You can still feel fear to such an extent, said the man. His hands that were peacefully crossed behind his back fell to his sides and he began to walk closer, each step making the slime abomination feel like a portion of its existence was being scrubbed out. I was wondering. After all, most emotions can only be truly felt and processed by the soul. But I suppose that even your many brains can help you to understand that you are mere seconds away from nihility. Nihility is nothingness, non-existence, the absolute end. But how? The slime abomination thought with rising horror as the system helped it to comprehend the meaning of the word through the magic of the common language. The man finally stopped walking closer when he reached just 2 meters away, which in proportion to the Wraith King's 13-meter height, was very close. I don't expect you to understand too well, but what you are feeling isn't just the threat of your body, or should I say bodies, dying, but something more than that. You are. The man paused and then for some reason raised both of his arms up. Was this the attack? Is this the end? Little did the abomination know, it was just for dramatic effect. The man blinked as if in confusion, and then his lips twitched as a wry smile spread across his face, seemingly comprehending something that caused him to once more drop his arms to his sides. Wow. Although I am unable to read the thoughts that are no doubt flickering through your mind, I don't need to be able to see how much your fear is rising. The Wraith King's ethereal cloak is practically about to fly off. How could you be so pitiful? The man said with a sigh. Unfortunately, the words brought the creature nothing other than increasing fear. It couldn't feel ethereal things like embarrassment or humiliation because ultimately, there was no pride or dignity to protect in the first place. The abomination didn't have a soul at all. Fear so dense that I'm half expecting to feel it. The man said with a slow shake of his head. But what's more interesting is that despite my sincere attempts, my voice isn't changing that at all. How wonderful, I have learned today that my voice's ability to affect emotions requires the target to have a soul. Or something like that. The man just kept talking and talking but most of it was just flying over the slime abomination's head. Anyways, as I was saying before, what you are feeling is not just the threat of your body dying, but actually the threat of everything that you are completely ceasing to exist. Nothing of you would remain, and if you had a soul to erase along with everything else, it could only be imagined the state you would be in. You might have even comprehended the intent of fear. Yes. That is what I am feeling. I'm finished. The abomination inwardly screeched with terror, still not daring to speak out loud despite being capable. The Wraith King's ethereal body spazzed out even more and looked a few seconds away from distorting out of its humanoid shape and dispersing into the wind. But no need to worry, I have no such intentions. The man said with a sudden cheery smile as his aura abruptly vanished, taking along with it the feeling of destruction that had been plaguing the slime abomination's mind. I have come here with a proposition. A deal, so to speak. And spoiler alert, you are not allowed to refuse. Otherwise, despite my noble and loving heart that could not bear to even harm even a single blade of grass, I really will be forced to erase you. The man said with the brightest smile that the slime abomination had ever seen. However, the slime abomination was not deterred by the smile at all, even with the mass of knowledge that it had obtained from humans telling it that generally, a smile was meant to display good intentions. Humans were simple creatures and most of them took whatever they saw at face value. They had barely even scraped upon the concept of deception like the more cunning races such as the Lupins and the Vulpines had done and believed whatever was displayed to be true. So for one of them to have come up with the grand illusion that encompassed the entire forest was extremely irregular, something that had left the abomination perplexed for a long time. But it was because of this very illusion that the abomination didn't dare to underestimate the man before him, didn't for a second dare to trust the smile on his face. He could be the very person that had created the illusion after all, and that would make him very much capable of doing as the hyenas did, smiling whilst they separated the flesh from your bones. Despite the fact that the soul-gripping aura had vanished and the abomination was even free to move as it wished, it didn't dare to do so in the slightest. In fact, if it were possible, the abomination would have frozen the Wraith King's ethereal cloak so that it would stop moving so erratically and so eye-catchingly. It didn't want to provoke this creature in any way. You still won't calm down? Even despite many concessions, could it be that you are doubting the sincerity of this heavenly lord? Are you seriously daring to provoke me? What insolence! Die for your sins, the man roared to the sky as his aura burst out once more. The terrified abomination desperately tried to run away but found its movements once again restricted, sending an additional wave of fear through its many hearts. It could do nothing but tremble as its life was once again hung by a single thread, a thread that was even smaller than the last. But just as it was thinking for sure that this was the end, the aura once again disappeared. Cough, cough. Sorry, little one. I've just always wanted to say that ever since I was a young buck with no strength. You must forgive me. The man said as his demeanor did a complete 180. What is even going on? The abomination thought after finally regaining the ability to do so. It had never before met such an abnormal being. Actually, I have come here because there is something that I want to test. The man continued as a sharp light appeared in his eyes. You are acquainted with a being known as Cleo, yes? The man asked as one of his eyebrows oddly rose. But the abomination didn't concern itself with that and hastily answered the question. No, the abomination spoke for the first time in the Wraith King's body, its voice deep and dark, but echoey and elusive. Golden-eyed man. Slime abomination. What? Even at this point you dare to lie, the man roared. The slime abomination's many hearts simultaneously skipped a beat. I do not know of a being that is named Cleo. I do not lie. Ah, I see. It's because you little ones are always trying to fight so much, never coming together to hold hands and watch the sunset. Tut tut, you guys really need to change. You don't even know the name of the second strongest being you ever met, the man said. Immediately, an image popped into the abomination's mind. You mean the cloud? Yes, I mean the cloud. His name is Cleo. Ahem, anyways. The man clapped his hands together. What would you say, if I said that I have the ability to grant you the same kind of power that Cleo has, HM? What would you say if I could make you an anomaly? You could do that? The abomination wasn't quite sure what an anomaly was, but it had never lacked intelligence and was quickly able to infer that an anomaly was what the cloud was and was the reason for its power, and that somehow, if the man was not lying, it was something that the abomination itself could become. As the implications of becoming such a thing began to bloom in its many brains, desire likewise began to seep in. But in comparison to the fear that was already there, it was like a few droplets of water entering a basin of poison. Oh yes, and quite easily too. So what do you say? Want it? The man asked with a nonchalant smile. I do. Good, Good, the man said in a jovial tone as he nodded his head up and down. No hesitation, that's nice. But you see, the good things in this world aren't free. The man suddenly held up his arms in what seemed to be a helpless gesture and was now shaking his head, but the abomination would never mistake the cunning light in the man's eyes for anything other than mischief, the dastardly behavior that the Vulpines were famously known for. Unfortunately, there was nothing that it could do about it. If you want to become an anomaly, you're going to have to agree to a few things for me. And what is that? The abomination asked, feeling more than a bit wary of the man's intentions. First, you will now become the guardian of this entire continent. It would become your duty to make sure that the continent does not suffer extensive harm and that no race on this continent ever goes extinct. Second, you will also stop your endless consumption of the beings on this continent. It's fine to devour those that provoke you or to devour corpses that are not undead, but never devour beings that are self-aware. Lastly, you are now my subordinate. When the time comes, you will fight for me or defend for me and obey all of my orders. Do I make myself clear? No more eating? The slime abomination asked, confusion, reluctance and discomfort clear in its tone, which was quite something considering its lack of soul and inability to feel most emotions. Perhaps if it could feel the more intricate emotions like a normal living being could, it would have yelled out with despair, something that Eridel found quite amusing. He had been silently studying the abomination this entire time and had learnt quite a bit, and it seemed that short from death, nothing truly worried it. At the end of the day, no matter how smart it had become because of its many brains, it was still an abomination and its only desires were to devour more and more life force and obtain more and more evolutions. Nothing else. You can still eat, but only within the boundaries I have set. Eridel said with a smile. You want me to guard the continent? The slime abomination asked. Yes. Why me? Why not the cloud? I already have other plans for Cleo, he's needed elsewhere. And so, what better than the next strongest being on the continent to become its guardian? For a moment there was silence. You keep addressing the cloud as he, it has a gender, the slime abomination suddenly asked. Eridel blinked. Not really. Not yet at least. He hadn't expected such a question. Then why do you say he, the abomination pressed? Eridel looked up to the sky as his right eye twitched. That is not something that you need to worry about, child. Instead, you should be thinking about your new duties as a guardian. Eridel was absolutely not going to tell it that he had simply assumed the cloud's gender. But that is not my purpose. The slime abomination responded. My purpose is to harvest life and all the power it has to offer. Even before I became an abomination and I was just a lowly slime monster, the only thing I knew was to kill. So it's aware of its identity as an abomination. Most aren't. Eridel thought. Most abominations across the universe were unaware of what they had become. Even the intelligent and self-aware ones were commonly deluded, thinking that they were perfectly fine even if they were most certainly not. It was like something was preventing them from knowing what they truly were, and it was an oddity that even the golden orb that had granted him so much knowledge had not provided any info on. However, clearly, the slime abomination was a cut above those deluded abominations. Well, it's not too surprising. With the amount of intelligence that it amassed in all this time, it can probably still utilize the system. I'm sure you'll pick up a thing or two once you get a brand new soul, he said out loud. Either way you can't refuse, so you better start thinking. How do we start? The slime abomination said after a while. Eridel pointedly gazed at the Wraith King before him, whose intangible cloak was still fluttering wildly, albeit not as bad as before. You can start by getting out of that body first. I'll be waiting for you at the cave. With a single thought, his body was replaced by beautiful golden lights that showered his surroundings in a fantastical display of might. Eventually the lights disappeared and he was nowhere to be found. But in reality, he had already relocated himself to the cave he had sealed the slime abomination's true body in. Slumped ahead of him was the giant form of the slime abomination in all of its pulsing and sticky glory. It was of course still wrapped by the golden chains that sealed most of its capabilities, and nothing had changed at all. He was still unable to read the abomination's mind, but he had been suspecting that the main reason that it had chosen to make the Wraith King an original undead instead of a corpse was because it had the desire to escape. Perhaps it thought that it could find a method to escape using the Wraith King's body. Something utterly futile. Well, whatever the case, there was no longer a need to escape. Eridel was going to let it out himself. The truth of all this was that he just wanted to see if it was possible for something that was alive but without a soul to become an anomaly. And what better target than the slime abomination? If the transformation was successful, the slime abomination would become something so special that even calling it a calamity-grade abomination would become a mockery. To have such a thing under his control was not something he was easily willing to give up. A few more seconds passed before the heavy chains moved and emitted loud sounds that signified the fact that the slime abomination had returned its consciousness to its body. It wiggled for a moment in what seemed to be the equivalent of a stretch before settling down. "It's good to see you. Are you ready?" Eridel asked as a grin once more crept its way across his face. He was very excited to see what would happen. If the process failed, the slime abomination would likely die and it would be a rather great loss. After all, calamity-grade abominations didn't grow on trees. But if he succeeded? "No. I would like - the slime abomination began. "Great. What a courageous and valiant young kid. Let's get started." Eridel interrupted, completely ignoring the abomination's troubles. "Brace yourself," he yelled with an exhilarated voice and a wild grin as he lifted his arms up to the sky. Suddenly, enormous amounts of magical energy began to flood the cave, and it was so quick that in a span of a few seconds, the amount of magical energy in the area had become so concentrated that it began to become visible. The cave was suddenly filled with golden mist, the sparkling and ethereal kind that you would expect to be surrounding precious treasures or lucky items. And all of it was being vacuumed into the slime abomination's body. Roar! The slime abomination let out a loud eldritch roar that sounded like it had come from all kinds of nightmarish creatures that had clawed their way out of the abyss. And it was such a terrifying sound that even the undead above that rarely ever experienced fear began to either flee in random directions or collapse to the ground in varying states of paralysis. But perhaps that was because they knew exactly who was screaming. Eridel on the other hand was grinning widely with glee. Clearly he was enjoying himself. However, when he noticed that the abomination that was seemingly trying to grow in size was being suppressed by the golden chains wrapped around it, his eyes narrowed. The reason that the chains were still there was because of two reasons. He found the fact that it was suppressing the abomination's aura useful. After all, if left uncontrolled, it had the capability to corrupt surrounding magical energy and turn it into something else, something that he suspected could cause complications. So although the corruption took a while, Eridel had been of the mind of destroying all possible factors that could cause failure. But looking at the state of things, it was best to just let things run its course. Well, no matter. If it fails, it fails. Eridel thought with a slightly dampened mood. With a single click of his fingers, the chains shattered into tiny motes of light before disappearing altogether. And as expected, the slime abomination's power, which had been restricted for 45 whole years, burst out with unrestrained desperation like an apocalyptic volcano. The aura completely filled the space, adding its multi-shaded gray colors into the golden mist and radiating a powerful sense of death that even made Eridel's eyebrows rise. But others were not as calm. Those that yet to leave the abomination's direct domain of influence collapsed on the spot, and those that had fallen immobile above the abomination's cave, completely lost consciousness. It was quite the terrifying sight. But the truth of the matter was that, technically, the slime abomination wasn't actually the second strongest being on the continent. After all, it had been sealed for 45 years and hadn't even been able to enter the fourth realm yet, unlike the other hegemons of that time that had immediately entered the fourth realm as soon as the barrier to the realm had been removed. The abomination had been sealed before it could enjoy the unlocked fourth realm. Its current cultivation at the moment, even though that was bound to change at any second, was at the 9th stage of the third realm. So how could it be that with just its peak third realm aura alone, it was sending everybody including the original undead, fleeing or unconscious? Well, that was all accountable to one thing: bloodline suppression. The slime abomination was the progenitor of all undead in Iridius, and coupled with the fact that it had assimilated countless other bloodlines into its own, that gave it an overwhelming advantage over those that were tied to its bloodline, and it was not something that could be easily circumvented. Be that as it may, the original undead who were all around the 4th or 5th stages of the 4th realm and the Wraith King who had been boosted to stage 6 were still capable of easily beating the 3rd realm slime abomination silly, but that was only if they could overcome their innate fear. As it stands, they, with the exception of the Wraith King, were more than comfortable with running away. And soon, it was looking like the great chance that the Wraith King had over his sire was about to slip away. The anomaly transformation, along with the white tribulation circle that was beginning to form in the sky, would more than assure that. Gold, white, blue, red, rainbow. These were the 5 grades that a tribulation could use, and each one was more fatal than the last. Eridel had previously predicted that the slime abomination would suffer a single white tribulation light and then 2 blue ones. But now, with the anomaly transformation added into the fray, things were likely to be different. That was the second reason why he hadn't wanted to remove the chains, but it didn't matter anymore. Roar roar. The slime abomination continued to roar as its body endlessly soaked up the ambient magical energy and continuously grew. In fact, Eridel could even see what looked like golden liquid swirling beneath the abomination's outer layer. He had no doubt that it would eventually fade away, but he couldn't help but shake his head as something that he had already guessed before was finally confirmed. No other living being, undead or not, would be able to do what the slime abomination was doing. They would simply implode. Even if they had special techniques or physiques that enabled them to endlessly devour essence like Yorma's sky-devouring bloodline or indomitable bodies that could withstand large amounts of stress, none of them could close to the slime abomination's aberrant constitution. Their bodies just simply wouldn't be able to take the extremely rapid amount of changes. Eridel's eyes narrowed. He really wanted this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to succeed. Whoa! A loud sound came from up above. Eridel's eyes narrowed even further. As expected, he mumbled as he let out a sigh and looked up to the sky, his peerless eyesight piercing through the ceilings of the cave network and zoning into the slime abomination's tribulation circle which had just turned blue in color. 3 guaranteed blue tribulations, Eridel thought as his brows furrowed. And there's even a chance of the last one being red. How miraculous. But it was also dangerous. Very dangerous. And if Eridel didn't want to turn that blue color red, or God forbid rainbow, he dared not intervene. Although helping someone else in their tribulation was possible, the requirements for doing so no matter how strong you were very strict. And the consequences for unauthorized assistance were at best, very, very painful, but it was most likely for all parties involved to die. Eridel did not meet these helping requirements and as such, the slime abomination was completely on its own. Good luck, he whispered. Flash. As the abomination continued to grow, the giant blue tribulation circle above gave its first pulse, signifying the start of its energy gathering. 2 more pulses and the abomination would be forced to withstand the attack of the first tribulation light or die. 30 seconds later. Flash. The energy gathering speed for the slime abomination's tribulation was multiple times faster than what Eridel had experienced in his own tribulation, but that was to be expected. His tribulation circle had been more than double the size of his planetary body in order to be capable of dealing with him. The amount of energy it needed to reach saturation was too high, which was much to Eridel's benefit. Who knows if he would even still be standing here without such long intervals. Unfortunately, the slime abomination would not enjoy such benefits. 40 seconds later. Flash. Eridel. Goo! The slime abomination let out a roar of fury and disdain as it instinctively sensed the judgment coming from the tribulation above. But before it could even make sense of what it was feeling and why it was feeling that. Ba wa wang! A blue blinding ray of light descended from the ceiling of the cave as if it were an illusion, and then slammed into the slime abomination with the impact of a shooting star. Ayayawa! The slime abomination let out a terrified scream of pain as chunks of its slime evaporated in an instant. This was without a doubt the most damage that the slime abomination had ever suffered in its entire life. After all, even before it became an abomination, it had been ridiculously lucky enough to never encounter a being that could contend with it, and that was why it had even managed to rise to the 3rd stage of the first realm in the first place. But it was this exact blind luck that was putting it in this predicament in the first place. The harvesting of fortune was something that would always end up in suffering, and now was fate's time to collect. Meanwhile, Eridel was looking on with amusement. Despite the terrific damage that was done, it wasn't something that the slime abomination's grotesque physique couldn't recover from, especially since it was still being flooded with magical energy. He was having high hopes. But he couldn't help but idly wonder what would happen if the slime abomination also had a soul to be targeted as well. Perhaps, in that scenario, this would have been the end of the abomination of the north. The fact that the slime abomination didn't have a soul was actually the reason that Eridel originally didn't give up all hopes of having an anomaly abomination. After all, other than Gaia, who had her own soul cultivation technique, and the Phoenix of Envy whose soul was unfairly upgraded alongside his body in energy by the essences of envy, nobody else on the planet, other than a few special people like Sierra who had obtained memories from Eridel, even knew what a soul was, talk less of having the ability to train it. The minute upgrades to the soul that they received in every of their essence cultivation breakthroughs was absolutely not enough. A blue tribulation light would have dissipated their defenseless souls so quickly that they wouldn't even know it when they died. Luckily, the slime abomination didn't even have a soul to be attacked. Eridel raised his right hand and then clenched his first as if he was squeezing something. In the next moment, something in his hand seemed to explode and golden light engulfed the entire cave. When the light had gone, he along with the slime abomination were nowhere to be found. However, not even a blink later, both Eridel and the abomination had reappeared on the land above the cave with another flash of light. They had teleported. Having noticed that sooner or later the abomination would become too big to fit inside of the cave, Eridel had taken the first opportunity to relocate the abomination to the outside world, allowing them both to directly witness the terrific beauty of the blue tribulation circle and the peerlessly white tribulation cloud that surrounded it. Another benefit to this was that the abomination could now see what was attacking it and do its best to defend itself. This was the most that Eridel could do to help the abomination, and it was only possible because the tribulation light had just been fired and it was currently on cooldown. If he so much as pushed the abomination, even if the tribulation circle was just in its pulsing phase, then he would have been in deep trouble. Eridel sighed as a mild feeling of helplessness took hold of him for the first time in a long while. But he wasn't going to dwell on that. For now, he was going to take this short moment of reprieve to focus on a few other things. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, for example. They were doing quite well, and thanks to his connection to them, he could monitor whatever they were doing at all times. Currently, the creature of conquest had already developed a soul and it had been fully confirmed that she was female. But this was to be expected. Her personality was built on the foundations of the memories she had absorbed, and it seemed that the first meal that she had ever had, the purple-skinned Onyxian girl, had left the biggest imprint. The other horsemen were doing pretty well and they were increasing their strengths very quickly, but it would take them a longer while before they could catch up with their eldest sister and form their own souls. Eridel also gave cursory glances to people like the girls he had marked in the Yamulon High World and other creatures in his own world who he had high hopes for. He already had guesses for the entities who he thought might be taking 5 of the 6 remaining deadly sins, but he couldn't find anyone on the planet that was worthy of inheriting the sin of pride. The High Human Empress had mellowed the more knowledgeable she became of the world, and people like the Crying Ghost had critical flaws that barred them from the sin of pride. Eridel himself wouldn't be able to inherit pride even if he was capable of bearing a sin. After all, it was very hard to be as intelligent as he was, and genuinely think that he was the #1 unparalleled being in existence, greater than the universe itself. But it was that kind of retarded thinking that was just one of the requirements of inheriting the sin of pride. Which was why he and the High Human Empress would never be eligible. Eridel rolled his eyes. Whether or not an inheritor of pride would be born, he already had his hands full with other things and didn't need to think about it. Especially not right now. 1.5 minutes later. Flash. The second tribulation light had begun to charge. Both the cloud and the tribulation circle began to grow in size, and by the third pulse, the entire tribulation circle had become 3 times bigger, a testament of its greater might. Boom! Just like before, a blue ray of light descended from the sky to strike the abomination, drawing a woe-inducing scream from its many mouths once more. The only thing that was different was that the size of the tribulation light and the scale of the damage had increased exponentially. In fact, it was so bad that despite regrowing some of its mass thanks to the other evolution it was undergoing, this newest attack had vaporized half of its body into nothingness, reducing its size so drastically that it was even smaller than the time it got hit by the first tribulation light. But still, it lived. It was smoking quite terribly, emitting a strange, but not repulsive, smell, and screeching out wails that would even leave a banshee incapacitated, but it would recover once more. What Eridel found fascinating was that as intended, the tribulation essence left in its body was changing it at a cellular level. This was unlike the effects that it had on others where it would only raise the quality of body, soul and essence. This was something quite permanent, something that was being encoded into the abomination's DNA and changing it permanently. And yes, this meant that whatever the result of the effects, it would be passed on to the descendants that it might have from here on forth. But why? Eridel didn't quite know. No other abomination, in the Iridius world, had ever reached the 4th realm before, so he didn't know if it was a special phenomenon that was unique to them. But he had a strong suspicion that it was a result of the fact that from a cellular level, the slime abomination was already changing, already becoming something that much greater than before. Perhaps the anomaly transformation, which was being aided by the Eridel system, had made use of the tribulation essence to implement some changes. Well, whatever the case, there was nothing he could, or even would, do about it. Although the tribulation had gone into cooldown and he could now do whatever he wanted to the slime abomination for the next 2 minutes or so, he wasn't capable of altering the changes it was undergoing. He could pause it or even reverse it, ending the anomaly transformation then and there, but he had no way to make it behave normally anymore, no way to freely choose what he wanted the cellular changes to be. He was powerful, very powerful, but not that powerful. He would of course not defeat the entire purpose of him being he by stopping the process, so he could only watch. Besides, he was sure that no matter what, the changes wouldn't be that excessive. After all, the purpose of tribulation essence at its core was to refine the entirety of someone's being and remove impurities, making a being more pure and more in harmony with themselves, not to mention a lot more powerful and talented. It was only the strike of tribulation light whose purpose was to deal out punishment on behalf of the omnipresent laws of fate and disperse the fortune. So what much difference can be made if the tribulation essence was only doing a bit more than it was supposed to? Eridel could only see it being correspondingly more beneficial. But still, he didn't let such a simple and naive thought take precedence in his mind and opted for a wait-and-see approach. 2 minutes later, Eridel's eyes narrowed as he began to notice peculiar changes taking place within the slime abomination. For some reason, the various cells within its body that denoted its affinity for elements and the like, seemed to be on the verge of doing something crazy, something so shocking that just the idea had his fingers twitching. But surely not. Surely, what he was seeing was not the slime abomination's body attempting to fuse all of those affinities into one. Surely, the abomination that had started as a lowly slime, was not about to undergo the special phenomenon that gave rise to the birth of that affinity. But all it took was one effortless glance at the system acting within the abomination for him to see that it was aiding the abomination to do that very thing, and Eridel's eyes constricted. It was true. It was true. The slime abomination, this aberrant creature that had begun as the lowest of the low of all monsters, this mere fourth-realm entity with a quality of being that wasn't even that high, was trying to not only form chaos essence, but the chaos affinity. Madness! Eridel almost spat out. His skin paled, honest to God paled as an understanding of what was going on crossed his mind. Of course, there was no blood in his avatar to genuinely cause such a reaction, so it was just purposeful theatrics. But he was still incredibly flabbergasted. The chaos element. The terrifying essence that was rumored to be the dawn of all things, the very essence that was said to have caused the creation of the universe and of all of its elements. Harnessed by a mere slime. Eridel stared at the slime abomination with wide shocked eyes, looking shell-shocked, but then, what a joke, he roared out as various emotions flickered through his mind at superluminal speeds. It was real. The slime abomination had somehow achieved a situation in which it was being blessed with the opportunity to become a life form that was attuned with chaos. An ultra-rare event that almost never happened. But the joke was that it was even rarer for it to succeed. And if it didn't succeed, the only other outcome was death. The slime abomination, the treasure that he had placed a lot of hopes on, was done for. In memories provided by the golden orb, beings many times more qualified to inherit the chaos element had perished. The slime abomination had no hope. But what had caused this? Was it the tribulation essence? Or was it because the various elements in its body had reached saturation thanks to its transformation to anomaly? Or was it because of the underlying laws of the unprecedented anomalies themselves that had opened this gateway to doom? Eridel did not know. It was infuriatingly frustrating, and he almost wanted to stay here no matter how long it took so he could discover the truth to his answers, but he knew that would be foolish. In fact, he had to leave, and now. The failure of the chaos transformation always caused serious environmental damages, and he wasn't sure that his sixth realm avatar would be able to withstand it even if the transformation was initiated by a fourth realm being. Fuck! Eridel crudely roared. What made him feel even worse was that he knew that the chaos transformation was optional. It was something that was unbelievably hard to obtain, but something that could also be activated or not at will once obtained. You could decide to use it whenever you wished. Which meant, if the slime abomination had bothered to wait for the right time, it could have become an anomaly abomination with an affinity with chaos. How impressive would that have been? But the fool, and Eridel was also looking at himself at this, had probably been helplessly driven by its instinct to evolve no matter the cost, causing such a premature and suicidal decision to be made. Aakak, Eridel sighed as he began to forcefully smother his emotions, something that had become easier to do ever since he had elevated the flame of his will, back when he had undergone his own tribulation. What a severe loss. Eridel muttered. However, even though his tone, body language and facial expression had become relaxed, just one look into the golden eyes that looked like they were about to start leaking lava, and even a fool would know that it was all a lie. He was very, very, very angry. And he wasn't quite ready to let go of that particular emotion. But it was just as he was about to disperse his avatar, his mind already making all kinds of calculations to ensure that something like this would never happen again, that a flare of a very familiar energy that he had been expecting but had nearly forgotten about because of all of the chaos, emerged from the slime abomination's body, snatching his attention. A unique energy signature began to rise from within the slime abomination, but it was extremely fragile. In fact, it was so feeble that if Eridel wasn't as capable as he was, he wouldn't have detected it at all. But not only could he detect it, but he knew exactly what it was. It was none other than the slime abomination's soul. Clearly, despite the continuous interruptions of the chaos transformation and the tribulation lights, the anomaly transformation has not halted at all. Instead, it had sped up. According to Eridel's calculations based on prior experiences, the creation of the Neo-Soul should have taken at least 3 more minutes, and that should have happened after the physical changes. But obviously, nothing was going as planned anymore and Eridel didn't even feel like reacting anymore. What had just happened had not saved the abomination. Not even in the slightest. In fact, it had only ensured its death even more. After all, going by the rapidly ballooning size of the tribulation and the nearly imperceptible but still there red aura that was beginning to surround it. The soul, the very defenseless soul, had just been targeted by the tribulation. Eridel looked up at the sun. Really and truly, the slime abomination was probably the most lucky but unlucky person he had ever met, in person. He couldn't help but wonder if fate or the so-called heavens were dipping their fingers into the abomination's life, trying its hardest to make sure that the abomination perished. If things had gone as normal, the abomination should have begun to form its soul after the tribulation had already ended, ensuring its complete safety. But instead, its soul had chosen right before the final strike of the tribulation, the most dangerous time of all, to form. Even if the tribulation didn't correspondingly rise along with the abomination's new-found potential and stayed at a regular blue tribulation, it still would have been enough to erase the abomination's soul, probably ending its physical body right along with it. The slime abomination was finished, and if those increasingly terrified screams and screeches were to be believed, it knew it too. Unbelievable, Eridel thought with faint exasperation. The things that were happening were too bizarre and they were completely out of the scope of his current understanding. But although he probably should have started leaving by now, he couldn't help but feel like he had to stay. Like this was an event that he absolutely could not miss. It was probably how a mortal scientist felt when they found themselves lucky enough to witness the birth of a star, or the death of one. Well, whatever. Even if I stayed, it wouldn't matter. The tribulation light would kill it before the chaos transformation Eridel was thinking, but then his eyes abruptly widened. NNNNNNNARRGHHHH. Suddenly, the slime abomination let out its most terrifying roar yet. An apocalyptic roar that was so horrifying and loud that not only did it reach impossible distances, it also erased the souls of those that were too close, causing the bodies that they resided within to drop like flies. Only the trees were able to stand firm, but their souls too, the primitive and fragile little things, had evaporated like smoke. Only the giant tree of death which had become a spirit tree, and Eridel, whose soul was incomparably mighty, were completely unaffected. But other than them too, every other soul in the vicinity had vanished. However, even though this looked like a purposeful malicious attack on the abomination's part, Eridel knew better. Feeling the unshakable grip of death, the slime abomination had likely been forced by sheer desperation to rapidly harness every drop of potential within its body, including its growing and incomplete soul. But the thing was that since its soul had been blueprinted by its body, unlike life forms that are naturally born, and was therefore imprinted with some of the qualities of chaos, the roar of desperation that it had released, powered by its others' paths of power, had caused severe damage to the soul of those in the vicinity. It was this chaos soul that had caused Eridel to be surprised, but not shocked. After all, he had, to some extent, expected that to happen. All prior anomalies had souls that were attuned with the same affinities that their bodies were attuned with. For the same principle to occur with the almighty chaos was certainly stunning, but he had seen others, within his inherited memories, with chaos souls before. The actual thing that caused him to be shocked was the depth of the blooming emotions that he was sensing within that roar. Other anomalies had emotions too, but their souls in comparison to the slime abomination's soul could be considered normal or even average. Nothing should have stopped their souls from perceiving and feeling emotions as efficiently as a normal life form could. But for the slime abomination who had a chaos soul? Emotions should have been far, far harder to process. That was the downside of a chaos soul. They had great power, but their emotions and thoughts were always in disarray. Only far, far into the future would they learn to ignore the chaos within their thoughts, or even rarer, manage to calm it. Eridel didn't know how the abomination did it, and this was becoming increasingly annoying, but somehow, its emotions which it had just obtained, were exceedingly stable. Well, when in comparison with a normal chaos soul's emotions that was. The despair that it was currently emitting had all the rights to be turbulent. But it wasn't just despair that he could sense. In fact, the despair that it was feeling barely caught his attention. After all, that was always something it could feel if its life was threatened enough. What really caught his attention was the feelings of regret. The feelings of injustice, the feelings of sadness, the feelings of unwillingness, but most importantly, the feeling of gluttony. Oh boy, Eridel thought. Boom. A loud explosion was heard as what looked like a black tsunami rose to the skies from every direction. It was extremely daunting, but what was even more appalling was that in reality, the black phenomenon was something that was emerging from locations all over the planet. The sin of gluttony. No inheritor had emerged because those that were worthy had yet to meet a certain threshold. But as soon as this abomination obtained a soul, it immediately became the inheritor? Ah, but then again, who else is more fitting? Eridel muttered as a wry smile crept onto his face. The strange phenomenon that looked like black tsunamis charging in from every direction, was actually the collective essence of gluttony that had been growing within the Iridius world. A vast majority of it had emerged from people themselves. After all, each time somebody felt any of the 7 deadly desires for a prolonged amount of time, the essence of that desire would begin to grow within them. 9.9 out of 10 times this would have no effect and could not be detected, so most people were completely unaware. The other places where the essence of gluttony could be found was in the rare special locations where multiple events driven by gluttonous desire had taken place. These places began to slowly grow their own essence of gluttony over time, and at a certain point, if enough gluttony essence had been formed, they would begin to proliferate themselves with or without the gluttonous actions of others. An example of this kind of special location could be a gluttonous king's feeding ground. All of the gluttony essence across the world was being summoned, with the majority coming from the seas and the North Continent itself, to complete the action they had been concept for, and that was to form the mark of gluttony and fuse with their inheritor. Using the word luck to describe what had been happening to the slime abomination for the last 5 minutes would be a gross understatement, and it seemed that the final tribulation light, or rather the laws of fate who were its wielder, were in complete agreement. Vreuum! A powerful sound vibrated through the air as the tribulation circle that had already been adjusting to its new power, began grow again. But this time, the imperceptible red aura that had emerged in the last growth completely enveloped the entire tribulation circle without hesitation. Just like that. The slime abomination was now forced to face off against a red tribulation light just like Eridel had been, 45 years ago. Of course, the one that Eridel had withstood was quite a few times stronger because of the fact that he had attacked it beforehand, but a red tribulation was still a red tribulation in the end, and now the slime abomination was at risk of being deleted. Quite literally. Although a blue tribulation would destroy one's body and soul upon death, there were still ways to revive such a person if you were powerful enough. Using the laws of time was just one example. But anyone who was killed by a red tribulation would cease to exist. It was so terrifying that even if Eridel himself were to scour the world archive and look into the past, he would never see that person again. They would have been removed from the fabrics of reality. The rainbow tribulation was even worse. If anybody died to a rainbow tribulation, not only would they cease to exist, but they would also be removed from all memory. Everything they had done would have been wiped from history and nobody would remember a single thing about them, not even Eridel. In fact, it was quite possible that some kind of impossible monstrosity had already been born, something infinitely times more aberrant than he or the abomination, but had ended up dying to a rainbow tribulation. Eridel would never know it. Thankfully, that was not what he had to deal with here. The red tribulation was daunting, yes, but he had already expected the slime abomination to die. It pinched a little that it would become something permanent and unchangeable, but only because it was a blow to his ego. Nothing he was capable of doing would save the abomination, and it irked him. However, he would learn from this experience and become greater. Meanwhile, the large sea of gluttony essence had finally arrived directly above the slime abomination, high up in the sky but underneath the tribulation. It caused the surroundings to look like the sun had already fallen and nighttime had arrived, but this only lasted for a little while because the essence of gluttony was already coalescing together at a rapid pace. Eridel's eyes narrowed. Now that he thought about it, with the most innate power that the sin of gluttony gifted its wielder, Devour, along with the stupendous assimilation power that slime abomination itself had, there was actually a chance that it could fuse with the mark of gluttony so quickly that it would be able to complete its soul creation and obtain a new outrageous peak of power just in time to face off against the red tribulation light. There was still a problem with the strength of the slime abomination's soul, but if it intentionally repurposed most if not all of the gluttony essence into its soul, then there was actually a chance. A chance to survive. So long as a tiny bit of the body and soul remained, Eridel knew that abomination would be able to make a comeback, especially since it was evolving and becoming a completely new creature. A chaos anomaly slime abomination, not to mention an inheritor of gluttony. Oh yeah, it was also undead. An undead progenitor in fact. What would it even be called? Abominable anomaly slime of gluttonous chaos? Anomaly slime of chaotic abominable gluttony? Undead chaotic anomaly slime of gluttonous abomination? There were so many choices. There was also the fact that unlike other anomalies, the slime abomination would be able to obtain a human form immediately. After all, it was still an organic life form and adhered to the essence cultivation system. Upon reaching Realm 4 and overcoming the tribulation, it would instantly obtain an enlightened form even if it was an abomination. How wondrous would that be? A brilliant light flashed across Eridel's eyes. Slime abomination POV. Erg. The slime abomination continued to roar as it had been doing all this time. Agony still a living current coursing through its every cell. I will not die, the slime abomination inwardly roared, something that it had been unable to do just a few minutes ago. Originally, when the tribulations had first begun, the slime abomination had not possessed the ability to think. After all, it had been relying on its multiple brains to possess a semblance of a mind, so when those were all simultaneously fried, naturally, the pseudo-mind that it had been granted with had also combusted. However, not that long ago, the system had suddenly congratulated it for the feat of obtaining a soul, a chaos soul at that. Something that whilst initially confusing, soon became a source of great wonder when it swiftly realized that it was once again capable of even feeling confused in the first place. This so-called soul had returned its metaphysical capabilities and more. In the beginning it was quite bad. The slime abomination could only think one stream of thought at a time and it was slow, but as time passed and the soul that it could now feel as closely as its body began to grow, the soul's capabilities rapidly began to expand. Opening numerous parallel thought streams were once again possible, but to an even greater extent, and thought processing speed was much greater than before. Simply outstanding, but what was a cause of slight confusion were the new emotions that it was rapidly experiencing. A few of them being the boiling rage and insufferable humiliation. What it was currently undergoing was nothing other than unjust. Yes, it now knew what justice was. Something that quickly became infuriating considering the fact that the concept had completely abandoned the slime abomination. These so-called tribulation lights that the system had said were supposed to temper its being, were clearly trying to accomplish something else, and that something else was destruction. The tribulation lights clearly wanted nothing other than the slime abomination's end, and it could feel it. Why else would it be powered up 2 more times? Why else would it nullify each and every bone of survival that the slime abomination had managed to grasp on? It's because the tribulations were unjust. Everything about the tribulation lights and all that they stood for were unjust. Not only did they want the slime abomination's death, but they also wanted to remove it from existence as well. The slime abomination had felt the threat of nihility just over 10 before and would never forget it. But unfortunately for the tribulations, they had underestimated it. They had messed with the wrong slime. Just as the slime abomination could sense its impending doom, it could also sense a great incoming boon. It seemed that even if the tribulations were unjust, the laws of this world were not. Something great was coming and the slime abomination was going to grasp it like it had never grasped anything before. It would not allow itself to die. It would devour the tribulations and feast on every last bit of it first. Every last one of them. Roar! The slime abomination roared out with fury and a sudden infliction of crazed hunger. And then finally, something changed. Something above, something possessing unbelievable yet familiar power, was rushing to meet it. The slime abomination could not see it, because it had lost the ability to see after the first tribulation light, but it could instantly tell that this was the boon. This was the thing that was destined to save it. It's here. Yes. Be devoured by me and become my strength. The slime abomination crazily roared as powerful instincts within itself began to steer its actions to do one thing. Assimilate. Devour. Boom. An explosion resounded throughout the forest as the boon slammed into the slime abomination. Almost immediately, the slime abomination was able to recognize the boon as some kind of complex symbol that possessed boundless energy. But instead of feeling any pain from the impact, the slime abomination only felt pleasure as the strange yet familiar essence quickly began to seep into its pores. There was also a lot of information about what it was unfolding within its mind, and the slime abomination began to feel elation. Ha. Yes. More. So good. Too good. What is this feeling? The slime abomination inwardly babbled as it felt joy for the first time. It had been chosen by the sin of gluttony. How could it not feel joy? More. Feeling ravenous for the energy it now recognized as gluttony essence, and also pressed for time, the slime abomination instinctively activated the precious skill that carried it to where it was today. Assimilate. As every part of the abomination's body began to release a suctioning air, the slime abomination felt a sudden increase of pressure as the gluttony essence forced its way into its body even faster. The slime abomination reveled in the feeling of joy as it rapidly felt its powers increasing, the very nature of its body changing as the multiple evolutions began to fuse into one, promising untold power if it managed to survive. But then all of a sudden, a voice that it would never forget began to speak directly into its mind. Do not forget that you are still within the grip of death, child. If you wish to survive the final tribulation light, you must guide all of the remaining gluttony essence into your soul. It's him. The slime abomination thought with a flash of fear. But then all of a sudden, it registered what was said and didn't like what was being said at all. I am not a child. I am 172 years old and there is no other life form on this continent older than I. You must respect that. Golden-eyed man. Slime abomination. Golden-eyed man. Slime abomination. Just when the slime abomination was about to become confused, it suddenly felt a very familiar threat of doom, and all the brand new feelings of shame, indignation and the desire for respect that drove it to say those things, fled. Soul-deep fear replacing it and talking all the space. The dangerous feeling only lasted for a split second, but it was enough to teach it several lessons. Just hurry up and direct the essence of gluttony to your soul. You will need to do that if you have any hope of survival. Came the voice of the golden-eyed man once more. Not daring to resist, the slime abomination hastily complied. Eridel's POV. It took a little while, but eventually, the slime abomination was able to locate its soul and send all the incoming gluttony essence towards it, nourishing it and skyrocketing its creation. Soon, the soul would reach completion and the power it would wield would be vastly incomparable. How interesting would a soul powered by both chaos and gluttony be? Eridel didn't know. But he was willing to do anything to find out. Only, there wasn't anything he could do other than to advise the abomination to power up its soul. And even that was only possible because the tribulation was still adjusting to its new power and didn't care about anything he might say that could be considered intervention. He could only hope that that would be enough. 3 minutes later. Any moment now, Eridel thought as he noticed the slime abomination's soul trembling, signifying that it was at 99% completion and that it was a hair's breadth away from becoming a fully functioning soul. At the same time, Eridel realized that the slime abomination's body had also experienced abrupt changes. Not only had it become extremely smooth and transparent unlike the sludge-like form that it had earlier, but its previous flat gray color had experienced a unique change. No longer was it just gray, but it was all kinds of gray. From the lightest gray can get without being confused for white, to the darkest gray can get without being confused for black. And the colors were not static, they swirled around beautifully like an elusive galaxy, sometimes moving slowly and sometimes moving quickly. Eridel had a suspicion that the speed depended on the abomination's emotions, but he couldn't confirm. But besides that, the slime abomination was no longer sticky. Its body glided across the ground like a drop of water on glass and it no longer splattered. And even though there were no longer any random shapes like arms, tentacles, maws and wings sticking out of it, Eridel knew that they could be resummoned or unsummoned in an instant. Lastly, not only was the slime abomination now 150 meters big all around, possessing a huge size that was no doubt an effect of the anomaly transformation, but the air around it gave off shimmery ripples as if the abomination was extremely hot. But Eridel knew that that was not the case. In reality, this was an effect of the slime abomination's chaos affinity, just like the swirling gray colors, and just looking at it could directly damage somebody's soul. Definitely an effect of the chaos transformation. But for those who could withstand its insanity-inducing effects like Eridel, the shimmery waves presented a beguiling sight that made the slime abominations look more ethereal. All in all, the slime abomination had become quite the thing to look at. Even Eridel had to admit that it had transitioned from one of the ugliest things on the planet to one of the most beautiful. In fact, he could already imagine the legends and myths that would be told about it in a few thousand years. But all of this made it clear that the slime abomination had completed its physical evolution. It was now 99.9% anomaly, waiting for soul completion, 100% a being of chaos, 100% abomination, even though it was no longer plagued by the deficiencies of a normal abomination, 100% undead, and roughly 72% sin of gluttony. But it would be way more accurate to say that the slime abomination had fused all of those things together and was now 100% that. Truth be told, calling it the slime abomination was no longer appropriate, and a new name was in order. But there was a time for everything, and whether or not the slime abomination would still be alive in 10 minutes was still extremely dubious. Thankfully, Eridel smiled. The soul was just about complete. A flash of soul aura burst out of the slime abomination's body, speeding past Eridel's avatar and descending into the distance. That was the soul pulse. Eridel's first soulmate, the pink gaseous planet, and every other anomaly before that had released one whenever their souls had been created. Not that it was exclusive to anomalies. Everything that gained a soul artificially or through whatever method released a soul pulse upon creation. But the slime abomination wasn't just emitting a soul pulse. On top of that was the fanfare and myriad lights that were dancing through the sky, the telltale sign that almost every heavenly treasure emitted when they were born/created. The lights for the slime abomination were, of course, all kinds of gray. Something that was directly tied to its affinities and was nothing special. But the music that was playing on the other hand, was very different to what was heard from the birth of the other anomalies. Their music would be considered nothing other than heavenly, but this music could only be considered malevolent. It was still beautiful to hear, albeit a little eerie, but the emotions they arose were definitely nefarious. Instead of making one want to clap their hands in celebration, they made one want to sacrifice somebody's head as a celebration. Thankfully, nobody other than Eridel and the stationary giant death tree were close enough to hear it, otherwise there might have been a serious problem. But even if all of Eridel's favorites were here and they began to kill each other, he wouldn't care. After all, when that soul pulse had brushed against him, he had felt a very familiar contraction within his own soul which temporarily dizzied his senses. Something he had only experienced once before. Seriously? Eridel muttered, his voice possessing the slightest tremble. Clearly, his emotions had once again run amok. That was how baffled he was. He couldn't believe it. Within his soul, one of the 5 unattached soulmate links had finally changed. No longer was it straight and unconnected, it was now fluid like a snake. Instead of being transparent and colorless, it was now dark gold. Rather than being dead and silent, it was now filled with life and emotions, specifically ravenous desire and confusion. The slime abomination was his soulmate. No, Eridel absent-mindedly whispered as fear began to rise. Slowly, he crouched to the ground. Placed his elbows upon his knees, rested his palms together against his lips and closed his eyes. No, he whispered once again. The fact that the slime abomination was his soulmate was shocking news, but for a second or two he had been quite interested. After all, the slime abomination had immense potential that was still growing. It hadn't even comprehended an intent yet, which it could now do since it has a soul, which meant that it still had room for an explosion of potential. Who wouldn't want to have such a partner for eternity? He wasn't even worried about the slime abomination not suiting his sexual tastes either, since that was impossible. One way or another, the slime abomination would obtain an appearance and personality that was so to his liking that it would be as if she, and never a male, because Eridel is only sexually attracted to females, was divinely crafted by the heavens solely for him. But, only a second later did he remember that this soulmate of his, was very close from never existing ever again, not even just dying. The Red Tribulation was extremely dangerous, and even with all the peculiar upgrades that the abomination had received, there was still a chance of her fading into just a memory. If that happened, even Eridel wouldn't be able to bring her back to life. Normally that wouldn't be such a problem. Eridel had barely met her, so he couldn't possibly be attached, and talented figures died even more unjust deaths all the time, so there was no need to dwell on it. Eventually, other talents on the level of, or even surpassing that of the slime abomination, would arrive and he would be able to protect their existences better. No problem at all. Except there was a problem. A very big problem. Eridel knew the effects of what having a soulmate die would do to a person, even if they had never met. In such situations, never having met before, the living soulmate would permanently feel like something was missing, and as a common consequence, might fall into hedonism in pursuit of that something. Such a person's will would eventually degenerate and their prospects for cultivation would collapse. In Eridel's case, where he had met the soulmate but had never really associated with her, regret would plague him for the rest of his life. The thoughts of what if would never be fleeting, and like in the first example, his will would eventually begin to decline. Even if he tried to alter his own memory to forget said soulmate, it wouldn't work. He would only end up like the first example, but worse. When a planet, even a sentient one, that was already half-crazed with the desire for evolution began to feel like something was missing, the catastrophe could only be imagined. Lastly, there were the type of people who had achieved the relationship you would expect of typical soulmates, star-crossed lovers. Whenever such people had their soulmate die, it wasn't hard to guess what would happen next. Death. Suicided to be specific. Some would attempt to bring the world down with them, ha ha ha, irrationally angry that the world would allow their soulmate to die. But eventually, it would almost always end with death. Thankfully, Eridel didn't belong to that first category. Hopefully I don't end up in any category. Eridel thought as he forcefully tried to quell his rampaging emotions. But they only continued to bubble and boil until he leapt to his feet with a roar. Fuck. This wasn't supposed to happen. The tribulation laws weren't even supposed to shackle me. I created it. I could have ended this tribulation in an instant. Fuck. I wasn't even supposed to have a soulmate either. Fuck. Eridel raged, current emotions and ignored emotions of the past affecting him. That was the thing about immortals, gods, or irregularly long-lived individuals, including reincarnators or people implanted with centuries or more worth of memory. They were expertly capable of managing how they act and were almost always in control of their emotions. But when they snapped, it was always a sight to behold. It doesn't make any fucking sense. What kind of creator has to abide by his own? Whilst Eridel swore up a storm, the last few effects of the slime abomination's divine celebration completely faded away. The slime abomination was now without a doubt a complete anomaly, and the powers it came with were hers to wield. The mark of gluttony was very close to being fully assimilated, and soon, the people all over the world who had succumbed to the enthrallment of gluttony, just like in the time the honorable brother had become the sin of envy, would be released from their dreams. All of those that had succumbed had forever changed. The way their bodies would react to gluttony essence was now utterly different, and the sin of gluttony would never be far away from them whether the slime abomination survived or not. The sin of gluttony was here to stay. Perhaps in a couple years, creatures in black would start to appear just like the creatures in green had. And if the slime abomination managed to survive, who knew what further methods she could use to augment her followers using her bestowal ability as an anomaly. All it would take was a contract, and a new subspecies would be born. The super ant colony of the Burning Nines, the golden humans of the heavenly sun, the blood fae and high devils of the blood tree, Zion the lunar lion Kaiser and the other creatures of the moon, Dodo the guardian of the forest of dawn and progenitor of glacial Saint Deer clan. All of these powerful creatures and races had been created by the wills of anomalies. Their powerful contracts upgrade beings who might have been ordinary, into unprecedented geniuses whose might could never be overlooked. One could only imagine what would happen if the slime abomination, who was both an anomaly and a sin, was to put her full efforts into upgrading someone using all of her means. Something amazing, that's for sure. 1.25 minutes later. Boom! A wave of gluttony essence burst out of the slime abomination's body as the mark of gluttony finally completed its fusion process. The slime abomination was now the sin on gluttony. The slime abomination let out a roar of triumph, but unlike its previous roars, which although dangerous to the soul were almost completely ineffective against a physical body, this roar possessed a hair-raising effect that could cause a weaker listener's brain to directly leak out of their skull. But that's not where the changes ended. As opposed to the sound of the slime abomination's voice becoming more eldritch or abyssal in correspondence the increasing terror of its nature, the voice had actually becoming enchanting, kind of like sound of a whale underwater but a few times deeper and multiple times more beguiling. It was such a deceptive sound. But clearly, when the vicious nature of chaos, the purity of the tribulation essence, the majesty of an anomaly and the enthrallment of a sin, was combined into an evolution, the results were distinctly quite strange. But understandably so. 47 seconds later. Flash! Eridel, who had long regained control of his emotions, was standing peacefully to the side with his muscles relaxed and his face serene. But the moment the red light shining down from the above experienced a brief flash, his fists clenched. The time of reprieve granted to the abomination had ended. The time to gather strength or marvel at what was already gained had ended. Now was the time to see if that strength would be kept. The slime abomination fell silent. 2.5 minutes later. Flash. 3 minutes later. Flash. This is it. Eridel thought, his planetary core pounding like an agitated heartbeat. Sensing the imminent strike, he decided to close his eyes. A mortal gesture. Closing one's eyes would never prevent reality. Boom! A red pillar of light descended from the tribulation circle and crashed into the slime abomination in the blink of an eye. The resulting effect was so terrific that the entire continent and surrounding sea felt it. The might of the red tribulation. As for the slime abomination? Well, 3/4 of it was gone. A whole 3/4 of the slime abomination's body and soul had evaporated like smoke, and more of it was quickly joining. Eridel's eyes widened. His pupils constricted. The entire world trembled. EIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIIII
The slime abomination let out a ghastly scream of pain as the tribulation hostile energies continued to ravage her insides. Eridel could also feel an echo of the pain through the soulmate link, something that was also being eroded along with the slime abomination's soul. But there was nothing he nor she could do about it, so like this, the slime abomination experienced torment of the likes she had never felt before for 12 more seconds, helplessly allowing more of her body and soul to disappear. And now, her previous 150 domineering size had been reduced to a pitiful 25, half the size she had been when she was wrapped in the sealing chains. But then something changed. A black-colored smoke began to billow out of the slime abomination's body. Gluttony essence. The unique energy that the slime abomination had only just obtained. Without a doubt, the slime abomination was trying to save its life somehow. But contrary to expectations, not only did she not get any better, she actually got worse. The elimination of her body and soul had picked up in speed by about 3 times. For a half of a split second, Eridel was appalled and had the urge to order the seemingly suicidal slime abomination to cease her actions immediately. Something that definitely would have backfired if he was foolish enough to do so. But then he caught sight of something that made him instantly swallow back the words even without the threat of joining in on the tribulation. And he began to grin. Good. Good. Who would have thought that in such a situation she would think of such a thing? Ha 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 ha. Eridel burst out laughing. Whether it was due to a stroke of luck or a spark of genius, the slime abomination had managed to bypass her fear of certain doom in order to perform a last-ditch action that could have accelerated her demise if her guess was wrong. But it paid off. Using her newfound powers of gluttony, she had begun to devour large amounts of her own body and soul, including the unrefined tribulation essence inflicting those areas. So yes, whilst this was effectively tarnishing her cultivation since she had to release what was devoured back into the air, in the form of black smoke, gluttony essence, it was saving her life. Perhaps if she had more control of her powers, she would have been able to use a technique that would allow her to devour harmful essence, release it back into her body, and repeat until the essence was more tame. But that was too much to ask for the new sin of gluttony. Nevertheless, Eridel was ecstatic. His soulmate's chances for survival had just shot up. To be honest, his desire for her survival was probably 98% for his own self-preservation. 1% of it was because he was interested in what a creature like her could become, and the last 1% out of curiosity for what they could be. What was the epitome of his desires?
What would she become that she would so perfectly match him? Well, whatever. He needed her to survive and the semantics didn't matter. 57 harrowing seconds later. Up above, the tribulation circle abruptly vanished and the tribulation cloud began to disperse. Eridel was gazing at it with pure eyes absent of any emotions when a sudden spark of enlightenment flashed through them. One can earn power, but can they keep it? That is the essence of tribulation. But if that is the essence of tribulation, then that must mean that it is a law of fortune and to some extent fate. After all, those are the driving forces that steer these tribulations. The ever so imperceivable laws of fate. Eridel turned his attention back to the ground where something smaller than a meter was releasing so much smoke that it couldn't be seen. With a strange expression on his face, he walked over to what was clearly the remains of the slime abomination until he was close enough that the smoke was caressing his face. Eridel's eye twitched. At least she survived. When the smoke finally faded away, what was revealed was not a small ball of slime, but actually a small human child of around 10 years old. She had pale white skin with a soft silver moon-like hue, long silver hair that reached her waist and sharp black nails. Eridel blinked. His eyes scouted every inch of her unclothed body, trying to see if he would feel any kind of sexual attraction, but it ended in failure. I was slightly worried that my soulmate would tempt me into pedophilia, but I guess not. Well, it makes sense. She's supposed to become the so-called woman of my dreams, not spawn as it. And since every sexual fantasy that I have includes mature woman, she's very clearly not ready yet. For me to not feel lust at this moment is as it should be. He could tell that she would definitely grow up to be a great beauty, even despite looking half dead, but it was just that. No sexual attraction of any kind. Eridel released a small sigh of relief and then smiled. He had known that this would happen, but with the soulmate mechanics becoming a part of the world's integral laws, he was a little worried that he would fall victim to peculiar upgrades. Luckily, that was not the case. Looking at the fragile girl who looked a few breaths away from death, and then thinking about the giant monstrous slime that had once pushed the North Continent's inhabitants to the brink of extinction, Eridel couldn't help but marvel at the irony. Technically, the slime abomination should have been given a fully matured enlightened form like everyone else that had come before her. The Crystal Dragon King, Wraith King and Azura had all been blessed with adult enlightened forms right away. So why was the slime abomination different? Was it because that deep down in Eridel's degenerate core, that this was the type of body that he secretly desired? No. Of course not. The real reason why she looked like a child had nothing to do with Eridel and was all to do with what she had done to herself in order to survive. In order to rid herself of the red tribulation light's harmful unrefined essence, she had essentially destroyed the majority of her own cultivation. Unlike enlightened beings like humans and elves, creatures who relied on an enlightened form to become humanoid, like beasts and monsters, had an appearance that was heavily tied to their cultivation. Now that the slime abomination had fallen into the first realm of essence cultivation, her enlightened form reflected that. And it wasn't just her enlightened form either. Before she had transformed, Eridel had seen that her true form had been reduced to 1.6 meters and was completely incomparable to her previously domineering size of 150 meters. Well, whatever, what was lost will be regained. But more than that, I can actually use this to her advantage. If I temporarily wipe her memories and send her to live off with the humans, she can live out her childhood in relative peace and develop a healthy mind until she's ready to reclaim what she was. Eridel thought as he crouched down to her side, pressed a glowing hand to her forehead and began to heal her body and soul. There could be a slight problem with her growing up too fast if she cultivates too fast or growing too slowly if she does the opposite, but with proper seals placed in a timely manner, that wouldn't matter too much. At least now that she has an enlightened form, she can cultivate by absorbing ambient magical energy into her body and won't need to rely on her devouring abilities or the slaughter path of the monster race. Thinking about it, the slime abomination had quite a lot of methods to gain strength, no? Eridel felt a tendril of pride at the thought. Well, I suppose it makes sense that only reality-bending freaks like her are worthy of being my soulmate. 1 minute later. The slime abomination's body twitched. Thanks to Eridel's efforts, her body and soul, which she might not have ever been able to heal to perfection on her own, due to the insidious nature of the red tribulation and the nigh-permanent damage it had caused, had been perfectly healed. But that was 17 seconds ago and it was only now that she was stirring. Eridel could feel the girl's energy levels abruptly rising and he knew that she would be waking up any moment now. 5 seconds later, the slime abomination's eyes snapped open. And yes, snapped. That was the only way to describe how quickly it was done, along with the impact the eyes themselves had when they were revealed. Whistle. Eridel whistled in approval. Her sclera was normal enough, but her irises and pupils meshed into one black color that was so dark that they resembled twin pools of abyss. They sucked in surrounding light and radiated a feeling of hunger and chaos so dense that it had Eridel raising his brows. But instead of moving around crazily like the two volatile emotions would suggest, her eyes were completely stable. They moved here and there in apparent confusion, but they moved so smoothly and steadily that Eridel had no doubt that this was the influence of her slime nature at play. According to his inheritance, most chaos creatures had eyes that were just as erratic as their energies. They twittered about in every direction like ravenous beasts and were just as ugly. But apparently, the slime abomination had not been branded with that particular fault. In fact, Eridel was certain that the tribulation essence that she had absorbed and assimilated into her DNA had removed most of the faults that normally came with a chaos transformation. Probably a big factor as to why she survived it too. The tribulation essence had both caused the chaos transformation and protected her from it. Wonderful, Eridel thought dryly. But back to the topic of the slime abomination's eyes. Eridel had also noticed that they bore the markings of an eye of power, similar to the 10 evil eyes on Eridel's planet. They were basically ineffective at the moment, but Eridel was sure that they would begin to display their secrets once the slime abomination gained more power. But that was quite a while away. Currently, the slime abomination was making small wiggles on the floor, unable to control her new humanoid body. It was to be expected. The slime abomination wasn't even used to bones and muscles, talk less of such a complicated humanoid body. Although Eridel was sure that she could convert the solidity of her body parts back into softness of her natural slime body and still keep the same shape, it would be useful to learn how to work a natural humanoid body. After all, such softness wouldn't work well against any kind of counterforce. For example, if she were to try to stand up in such a state, the gravity pressing down from above along with her upper body weight would cause her legs to deform. If she was intelligent, she would keep most if not all of her body the way a natural humanoid body should be, and then convert parts of it into slime if she so wished. Going by the slime abomination's numerous attempts at sitting up without unnaturally deforming or slithering, it could be said that she was quite the quick thinker. The urge to revert to her slime form must be riding her, so the fact that she was still in this form showed intent. Eridel smiled and peacefully crossed his legs while he waited for her to get the hangs of things. It shouldn't take long, after all. The memories of the many humanoid beings that she had devoured in the past should begin to help her soon. 6 seconds later, the slime abomination's energy levels that had been rising the entire time seemed to reach a certain threshold because suddenly, her hair, which had been a normal silky silver, suddenly experienced a grand transformation. Firstly, the single silver color split into the many gray colors of her true body, transforming something that was once just gorgeous into something that was extremely dazzling. But on top of that, not only did it begin to softly float without any stimulation from wind, but it also gained a slight transparency, which allowed one to see the few rand sparks of light hiding within that resembled stars. Whoa, Eridel muttered under his breath. Just with the improvement with her hair alone, she had seemingly transformed into an transcendent fairy. But with the juxtaposition that her nightmarish yet enchanting eyes proposed, her beauty became so impactful that it was actually quite stunning. Eridel had known there was something unnatural about her hair, but he hadn't known what. Who knew that it was just because it was lacking juice and needed a bit of energy to show its true nature? Calling her a divine beauty would be quite an understatement, and that was even despite the fact that she was a child possessing little to no sexual allure. But this presented a problem. Her eyes were already abnormal, but this hair? Nobody with a functioning mind would believe she was a regular human. Even the pale-skinned original undead would find it easier to blend in with the humans if you removed the cultivation factor. Well, no matter. Eridel would just add that to the list of seal. Suddenly feeling eyes on him, Eridel looked down just a few centimeters to see the fearful gaze of the slime abomination focusing on him. Ah, his voice had alerted her. Up till now, the slime abomination had clearly been disorientated and hadn't thought too much about what was in her surroundings, most likely focusing on her new body and its functions. It didn't help that he was also suppressing his presence and was undetectable if she didn't look at him with her eyes or hear him with her ears. But the jig was up now, she had found him. And she was scared. Quite understandably so though. She had been bullied quite a bit by him for the last 30 minutes and she wouldn't easily forget it. Plus, there was a possibility that she knew that he was the one that had sealed her in that for 45 years. After all, it wouldn't take much to connect the dots between the golden light that had initially sealed her in the cave and the golden light that had been shining from his body back in the forest. Not to mention the fact that he had easily unsealed her as if he were the owner of the chains, which he was. Originally, this shouldn't have been a problem. In fact, Eridel had wanted the slime abomination to fear him. Fear was a great motivator for hedonistic beings like the previous slime abomination, and it had worked out well, but now, she had ended up becoming his soulmate. For his own soulmate to fear him was quite inconvenient. Guess I'll just erase her memory of my Jonas avatar too. Who are you? The slime abomination asked, her childish voice slightly trembling. A regular voice, Eridel noticed that her voice, although as cute and pleasantly sounding as a child's voice could be, was just that. No double-layered voice or supernatural allure, nothing that gave the same impact as her eyes and hair. She sounded just like a regular girl. But who knows, maybe that would change in the future. Either way, it didn't really matter. Speaking of which, the reason she was a girl in the first place probably had a lot to do with the fact that as a slime she possessed the reproduction skill. Something that ant queens and the like also possessed. Although slimes don't possess genders, when the slime abomination became a humanoid, the most logical option for her gender was female rather than male. For the same reason the ant queens are only female, a slime that can reproduce should only be female. Eridel thought of all of this in an instant before refocusing on his little soulmate. The creator. Eridel answered her question with a slight smile. At that, the slime abomination fell silent. The term the creator didn't mean much in this time period since there was no knowledge of gods or the like, and it was likely that she thought that he was just being purposely ambiguous. Still, she didn't speak again, probably not wanting to anger him by probing further. Not that Eridel cared. Even before he met his two soulmates he had already deeply plotted a method to obtain a true incarnation, something much more impressive than this flimsy avatar that lacked life. It was in that form that he would start a new life and eventually gather his soulmates, so whatever impression that they had of Jonas didn't matter too much. So like this, the frightened slime abomination and the fascinated world avatar continued to awkwardly look at each other.